お待たせいたしました。ただいまより自然エネルギー
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for waiting. We will now like to start the international forum that is organized by the Renewable Energies Institute after 15 years. The first session will be on the accelerating global energy transitions. First of all, we would like to hear from Mr. Thomas Kerbacher, Chair of the Executive Board of Renewable Energy Institute, on the topic of the trajectory of the energy transition in Japan and the world. Thomas-san, please.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you in this room and behind computer screens. And also thank you for joining, and in the case of some of you, for joining several conferences since I was first representing Renewable Energy Institute at a meeting almost 15 years ago. Today we are gathering exactly 15 years after the great Japanese earthquake and the catastrophic consequences at Fukushima that motivated the founding of this institute to accelerate the development of clean, renewable energy for Japan. Today I will talk about the global trends and the comparison of what is happening in the world and in Japan. And these 15 years has seen a dramatic development of renewable energy. 15 years ago, renewable electricity was a bit more expensive than other sources of electricity. And there was a need for support mechanisms to make renewables competitive. That is no longer the case. In the beginning of this year, the scientific journal Science claimed that the breakthrough of renewable electricity was the scientific breakthrough of the year 2025. The development had reached a point where science decided this is now unstoppable for economic reasons. And many of us who have been working on renewable energy over the decades have noticed that there has been fluctuating political support for renewables, but the economic and industrial trend has been going in one direction only. If we look at the competition between different non-fossil sources of electricity, this diagram shows the dramatic growth in renewable electricity generation globally, and that nuclear has had to struggle to reach the previous peak level of 2006. In Europe, solar and wind overtook fossil fuels for power generation last year, which was quite a significant milestone in the development of renewables. And looking at what happened globally in 2025, the graphs for solar, wind, and nuclear look a little similar. As you can see, it is a very narrow margin for the full year of 2025. Michael Liebrecht, who has been speaking at our conferences previously, he concluded that most likely, with reservations for the precision of these statistics, most likely nuclear was ahead of both solar and wind for the full year, but for the second half, solar may have overtaken nuclear. And it is almost certain that in 2026, solar and wind electricity generation globally, each will overtake the global generation of nuclear. This diagram shows a decline in nuclear, and it's not a decline in absolute terms, but it's a decline in the relative share in percent of total electricity generation. So how is Japan doing in this development? Well, if we first look at solar and look at the share of electricity in Japan and the share of solar electricity generation globally, Japan is ahead of the rest of the world. And Japan was early in being ahead of the rest of the world. Japan had the world-leading industry manufacturing solar panels and cells in the late 20th century. And the industrial knowledge and capacity can be rebuilt. But we also see that in recent years, the global growth has been faster. In this diagram, the solar share in Japan appeared to decrease last year, or in 2024. That is not so in absolute terms. There was a slight increase in solar electricity production, but because of the total electricity generation in Japan increasing, the share decreased. On the other hand, wind power is not so well utilized in Japan. Here we see a dramatic difference between global installations and installations in Japan. I cannot see any physical reason for this. The wind resources in Japan are magnificent. In particular in northern Japan, on Hokkaido, it's wonderful. Few places in the world have those kind of wind resources. So it's more a political issue and an issue of the electric power companies wanting to avoid the competition for base load cheap electricity during all times of the year and the day. Solar provides peak load to some extent in countries like Japan, while wind would compete with coal and nuclear to an extent that may not be popular with the electric power companies. So Japan is ahead in solar, behind in wind, and in total for renewables, Japan is behind, as you see in this diagram, but following the same trend as the rest of the world, for the simple reason that the economics makes the development of renewables irresistible all over the world. The nuclear power that was a high share in Japan decreased dramatically after the reactor catastrophes in Fukushima. Restarts have happened, and the Japanese share of nuclear electricity is now higher than it was in 2012. However, globally, the share of nuclear electricity production as share of the total production has been decreasing, and Japan appears now to meet the rest of the world around 9% of total electricity generation. What will happen with the global share of nuclear, I think, is quite certain that in the coming few years it will continue to decrease. And with Japan, it may increase a little bit. But it is difficult to believe that the government ambitions of 20% will be ever reached. Japan does not have any fossil energy resources. Still, it's a significant share of Japanese electricity generation and used also in other sectors of the Japanese society, completely dependent on import of these fuels. After the Fukushima accident, when nuclear electricity decreased, the use of fossil fuels for electricity generation increased. But in recent years, with the development of renewables and also the increased electricity and energy efficiency, we see a decreased share of fossil electricity generation in Japan, trying to catch up with the global decrease. As I said, the explanation lies in lower prices. And the cost of particular solar and wind, and now also very important for the development, batteries, have been falling fast in the world, and solar and wind are now the cheapest sources of electricity generation in most parts of the world. And this is, as we said in the beginning, an irresistible driving force for renewables, hard to beat by political ambitions. But it's not only the economic performance of renewable electricity that gives the opportunity of renewable electricity to compete with fossil fuels. It's also a matter of energy efficiency. Electricity is a very usable energy carrier, and it's also, from renewables, more efficient to produce electricity from solar and wind compared to the use of fossil fuels, where about 2/3 are lost in the conversion from fuel to electricity. For heating, heat pumps are more efficient, utilizing ambient air as a heat source rather than just burning fuel. And in the transport sector, electrification offers significant improvement in efficiency and also much better performance of the vehicles. This also contributes to making electrification with renewable electricity hard to resist. In addition to these technical and economic arguments, there are also societal arguments of significance that are not often measured in economic terms or described as energy technology issues. And one, of course, is the global risk of unmanageable fast climate change. And the increase of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has resulted in the world getting hotter. 2024 was the hottest year on record. 2025 was slightly cooler, but still, all the last years have been the highest ever on record in global mean temperature. And the results we see as extreme weather events with droughts, fires because of everything getting very dry, but also examples of very high rate of precipitation resulting in flooding and severe societal consequences. On the nuclear side, the risks associated to ionizing radiation from radioactive pollutants from nuclear accidents and nuclear routine emissions from reactors operating has been, in some cases, now documented better than before. Previous records of health effects near nuclear reactors in Germany and Britain and France are supplemented now by a recent analysis of cancer cases around US nuclear facilities. We see effects that are not only cancer, but also cardiovascular diseases that are not often looked for, but when it has been possible, it has been documented to appear as a significant risk. And one recent study also shows that radioactivity as a form of general aging accelerator is also related to dementia. Last in this presentation, but not on today's newspapers, are the fact that the supply of fossil fuels, and in particular of oil, is very vulnerable to interventions. And what we have seen in the recent days with the war in the Middle East clearly illustrates the economic dangers of being dependent on imported fuels. The Hormuz Strait is extremely important for Japan, Korea, and China, who gets most of their oil from this strait. And when that is blocked, prices will go up globally, but it may be a particular problem for those companies who have contracted deliveries from countries where the oil passes these straits. The price went up dramatically. It came down quite dramatically because of US administration claims that they would protect the transport of oil. Unfortunately, that may not have been correct, and we'll see how the oil price evolves in the coming days with the armed conflict continuing and the difficulties of getting oil out through this strait is continuing. So there are many reasons, technical, economical, health-wise, climate-wise, and security of supply-wise, to replace these non-renewable sources with renewable sources. And that is true in particular for Japan. Japan is a country that was resource poor when fossil fuels and uranium was the source of energy with lowest cost in the 20th century. But now, a few years into the 21st century, when solar and wind electricity are the cheapest sources of energy, Japan is no longer an energy-poor country. Japan has immense resources of renewable energy and can make itself independent and a stronger nation by developing these potentials. So for Japan, the breakthrough of the year 2025 is something to congratulate Japan of. It is a fantastic opportunity for Japan. And with this, again, thank you very much, and we will now have a session with several international experts who will share their views on the development. Thank you.
トーマスさん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Thomas-san. Next, we would like to proceed to session 1, which will be on the topic of the accelerating a world poised for transition. We will be rearranging the stage. I beg your indulgence. We'll be starting shortly.
Is it? Yes, thank you. In the program, you saw that there were 4 speakers that we hoped for during this session. And one of the speakers, Francesco La Camera, Director General of the International Energy Agency, is based in Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi is one of the countries with airports affected by the military conflict in the Middle East. So he was not able to fly out of Abu Dhabi to join us, but he has sent a little video message that I hope we will be able to show on the screen now.
Dear Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor to address you at REvision 2026, the annual international conference of the Renewable Energy Institutes. While I regret not being able to join you in person in Tokyo, I'm truly pleased to contribute to this important gathering. I remember that in 2020, when the COVID started, I kept my promise to come to the conference. And I still remember we had just less than the people in the plane, but I managed to be there with you. Today, simply, I cannot fly to join you. I'm very sorry. At the same time, as I say, very honored to join you virtually. This year's conference carries particular significance. 15 years have passed since the great Japan earthquake and the accident in the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. Events that profoundly reshaped Japan's energy policy and triggered far-reaching reforms in its electricity system and energy transition strategy. Over the same period, global decarbonization has accelerated, with renewable energy emerging as the backbone of new power capacity, driving emission reductions while enhancing affordability and resilience. We made a decisive point, this moment for the global energy transition. The EU consensus adopted at COP28 sent a clear and historical signal. The world must triple renewable power capacity and double energy efficiency by 2030 on the path to net zero by 2050. Building on this momentum, COP30 reaffirmed the direction and delivered the Belém package, calling for accelerated implementation of the Paris Agreement, a just and orderly energy transition, and the tripling of adapting finance by 2035. Together, this outcome made one message unmistakable. Ambition is no longer the challenge. Deliver is. Gaps in finance, infrastructure, policy implementation, and institutional capacity continue to slow progress. The pace of action still fell short of what science demands and what equity requires. And yet, there are also strong ground for optimism. In 2024 alone, the world added 582 gigawatts of renewable power capacity, a record-breaking year, and the third consecutive annual record. Renewable accounted for 91% of all new power addition globally, with growth reaching an impressive 15.1%. And in 2025, preliminary data say we are going to have almost 700 gigawatts of renewable capacity added. But progress is not yet transformation. To reach the 2030 targets of 11.2 terawatts of installed renewable capacity, annual addition must exceed 1.1 terawatts every year between now and 2030, nearly double today's pace. Moreover, deployment remains highly concentrated. Much of the recent growth has occurred in Asia, while progress across G20 members remains uneven. At the same time, the global energy landscape is becoming more complex. Countries face mounting pressures to ensure affordability, energy security, system resilience, and geopolitical uncertainty and economic volatility. There is no one-size-fits-all pathway. National circumstances differ in resource endowment, energy demand, infrastructure readiness, and market maturity. Each country must design transition pathway that reflect its reality while aligning with global goals. What this requires is not only acceleration, but coordination, integration, and strategic alignment. In this context, Japan has a particularly important role to play. Japan's approach, simultaneously advancing decarbonization, strengthening energy security, and promoting economic growth, offers a pragmatic and balanced model. Its leadership in advanced technologies, from next-generation solar photovoltaic and floating offshore wind, to enhance the geothermal system in expanding the frontier of what is possible in renewable deployment. Equally important are Japan's policy commitments. Through its 7th strategic plan, its updated national determined contribution, and the plan for global warming countermeasures, Japan has articulated a clear long-term vision. A 60% emission reduction by 2035, on the path to carbon neutrality by 2050, and raising the share of renewables to 40–50% of the power mix by 2040, represent significant milestones. By sharing its experience, both in achievement and lessons learned from implementation challenges, Japan can help other countries accelerate their own transition and overcome similar barriers. So, ladies and gentlemen, conferences such as REvision are vital precisely because they bridge ambition into action. By bringing together policymakers, industry leaders, researchers, and innovators, this forum will strengthen international cooperation, advanced practical solutions. Knowledge exchange, technological innovation, and sound policy design are indispensable to scaling renewable at the speed and scale required. As the global custodian agency for the triple renewable target, RENA remains fully committed to supporting countries in turning pledges into projects and targeting tangible capacity on the ground. We will continue working closely with Japan and partners worldwide to close implementation gaps, mobilize investment, and ensure that 2030 targets remains within reach. The pathway is clear, the technologies are available, the economies are increasingly compelling. And what I like to say is that the competitiveness of the economy of tomorrow will be largely determined by the capacity of energy system to feed the economic system with a molecule and electrons at the lowest possible cost. And this is possible only if we move rapidly to renewables. Now is the time then to move from momentum to magnitude. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, important messages about the competitiveness of renewables and the resulting competitiveness of the economy. Now, in the panel, we have three other present experts in the energy area. We have Ali Izadi Najafabadi, who is the head of Asia for Bloomberg New Energy Finance, with long experience of Japan and Korea. We have Rebecca Williams, who is Deputy CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council and also a frequent visitor to Japan. And last and definitely not least, Amory Lovins, who has spent decades on energy technology and system development and is one of the pioneers in predicting the important role of energy efficiency as a way of keeping competitiveness in industry and in society. And I would like to give the floor first to Amory. The floor is yours.
Ohio gozaimasu. Thank you for the honor of summarizing some electricity surprises ripe for Japan, especially in using energy far more efficiently. We hear far more about renewable electricity. Its global generation in green has zoomed past nuclear in magenta, gas in blue, and probably now coal in white. In the first half of last year, the world added more raw solar capacity than it had operating nuclear capacity built over decades. Last May, China added a gigawatt of solar power every 6.25 hours. Nothing in energy has ever changed this fast. New rules. Renewables keep getting cheaper as we buy more, because mass producing more equipment causes rapid learning. In contrast, mining a commodity, fossil fuels, causes depletion and raises political risks, so costs rise. And since modular renewables are small, cheap, and quick to build, they can sustain lots of experimentation and rapid learning, while a single massive fossil or nuclear project is still under construction. Solar capacity alone is surpassing every other global source of electricity, while battery storage surpasses pumped hydro storage. Notice in the left graph how many rivals solar capacity has exceeded in just a few years. IEA estimated that 96% of new solar in yellow and onshore wind power in blue in 2023 was cheaper than new coal or gas power, and that about 75% beat existing fossil-fueled plants. Bloomberg NEF also confirmed that the cheapest way to meet a flat load is now solar or wind power plus backup, which can come from efficient and timely use, storage, renewables, or fuels. Renewables can also be incredibly fast. A year ago, North America's biggest microgrid was built in 4 months in Sparks, Nevada. Redwood Energy laid 20 megawatts of photovoltaic panels on the ground, then used novel power electronics and software to meld the world's biggest array of second life automotive batteries, about 800 packs, each wrapped in a white tarp and set on cinder blocks, into 62 megawatt hours of unified storage. Those batteries provide 2 to 48 hours of storage as needed for a few years, then get hot swapped and recycled. The result is a 100% solar, 24/7, 365 power supply, delivering 12 megawatts for on-site modular data centers, more reliably than grid power and cheaper than its 12 yen per kilowatt hour price. Solar microgrids are safe, silent, virtually water and maintenance free, zero emission, profitable, scalable, and if necessary, portable. This is what AI speed, ultra reliable clean power looks like. Gas, coal, and nuclear are not. And where land is costly, the batteries can be safely, cheaply, and compactly stacked. A further innovation from Australia should slash solar system costs perhaps by as much as half by eliminating frames, single module handling, racking, wiring, and foundations. Folded up, pre-wired rows of modules expand from a hinged stack in a shipping container into long rows like this that can easily be attached to land or structures or over water or crops. Is buying Chinese solar modules contrary to Japan's security interests? No, for 3 reasons. First, installing solar is buying, not renting. You have the panel for 30 years, so you have 30 years to figure out how to get the next one, or build plants to make it yourself. Waiting while you keep buying costlier power is expensive. Second, the solar power maker gets $5 of profit. You get roughly $500 of net present value that goes to you, not to China. Why cut off your nose to spite your face? Third, solar power is a means to an end to harvest the sun. It's just like how iPhones made in China are a way to harvest data. If you prefer to make it entirely in the US or in Japan, go for it. But until then, if you need one, buy it, as in the second point. Here's an update of my 3-year-old summary of some countries with modest or no hydropower, but meeting half or all or more than all of their annual electricity needs with renewables, with superior and rising reliability. For Denmark and Germany, over 5 times US reliability. The 99.999% reliable former East German utility, 50 Hertz, was 73% renewably powered last year and targets 100% by 2032. So as my colleague Clay Stranger says, the operators have learned to run these grids the way the conductor leads the Tokyo Symphony. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble together continuously makes beautiful music. The gigawatt scale grid of the state of South Australia expects to complete its transition to 100% solar and wind net generation next year. The upper graph shows the past 27 years of the monthly consumption mix. Solar in yellow and wind in green pushed out the coal in 2016, brown plus some imports in purple, and most of the gas, shades of orange, with very successful and lucrative stabilization by big batteries and by 4 fuelless synchronous condensers. The lower graph shows the dramatic reduction of power sector CO2 emissions soon to be profitably eliminated. South Australia is the only state not expected by the national market operator to have system strength shortfalls over the next 3 years. And now 37 big companies want to build factories there to use that affordable, stably priced, and reliable green power, totaling 10 times current demand. This matches Rio Tinto's choice of solar and wind as the main power for its new aluminum smelter, and BHP's for its copper mine, both using renewable baseload contracts. Apple's 4 data centers, all renewably powered since 2014. Colorado's over 90% solar-powered steel mill, and the Pentagon's preference for renewables to power its most critical missions, so renewables can do big, tough jobs. Advanced conductor wires carrying twice as much current could nearly quadruple the U.S. transmission addable by 2035, meeting over 80% of interzonal transmission needs to exceed 90% renewable electricity. Today's even better conductors with 3 and soon 4 times normal current capacity can decongest many grids and grow renewables even faster by routinely replacing the existing wires on the same towers. Further expansion would need far fewer new corridors and fewer smaller, cheaper towers. Japan has similar opportunities at far lower cost than now assumed. 1/5 of the world's new cars are now electric, and their batteries, parked most of the time, are a valuable grid resource. French drivers can already get a good electric car for free, charge it for free, and even make money by selling up to 21 kinds of services back to the grid when it's parked. In Europe, those services can be worth around $1,000 per car per year, several times more than the driving cost, creating profits for everyone. Japan could thus displace power plants and make the grid more resilient, especially against earthquake and typhoon. What about the demand side? Let me update a graph I showed here 3 years ago. Around 1975, U.S. government and industry all said the total input energy needed to make $1 of GDP could never drop. A year later, I heretically suggested it could drop 72% in 50 years. In the first 49 years, it dropped 65%. Yet just the innovations already added by 2010 could save another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at 1/3 the real cost. And now, 16 years later, further efficiency innovations can do far better, as I'll illustrate next. Using integrative design in 6 muggy Indian cities, 1.5 million square meters of integratively designed offices use 80% less energy than the Indian norm, with 10 or 20% lower construction cost, 60% less cooling capacity, yet superior comfort and satisfaction. Glare-free daylighting is delivered throughout by contract. If workers complain of glare and demand blinds, the architect doesn't get paid. But now there's an important new cooling option. Today's best refrigerative air conditioning systems in big buildings can now save 4/5 of their energy, but we could now eliminate the rest. In this shaded pavilion, Singaporeans stayed comfortable outdoors without cooling, drying, or significantly moving the hot, humid air. At 32 degrees and 80% relative humidity, their body's far infrared radiation was absorbed by panels shielded by a thin plastic film and cooled by 23 to 25 degree water. Special radiant roof surfaces can now cool that water passively even in full sunlight or under monsoon cloud, using no electricity. If this approach can be made cheap and vernacular enough to retrofit into the world's hot climate apartments and slum dwellings, that could potentially eliminate global growth in peak electricity demand. The world's cement and steel emit 15% of CO2, but are mostly wasted by inefficient structural design. Better design could save roughly half those materials, as I illustrated with this slide 4 years ago. For example, the thinner corrugated floor slab at the lower left saves 3/4 of the cement and all the steel, but costs less and builds faster. Conventional thick floor slabs are about half the total weight of a typical mid or high-rise building. Alternatively, thin vaulted floors have been commercialized in Switzerland. The 4-quadrant version on the upper right is simply craned onto its corner supports with no adhesives or fasteners, and can later be as easily removed for reuse elsewhere. In its first use, it saves 2/3 of the concrete and emissions and 90% of the steel. Reuse then saves 100% of both. Thin floors plus passive design, which eliminates a vertical meter-odd of mechanical plenum at each story, allow 3 stories with normal 2.8 meter ceiling height to fit in the vertical space normally needed for just 2 stories. Cost, complexity, and time fall dramatically. About 55% more net rentable space fits in the same height and the same footprint. Why would you build any other way? Half the world's electricity runs motors. Half their torque runs pumps and fans feeding into pipes and ducts. If those are made not skinny, long, and crooked, but fat, short, and straight, their friction drops by 80 to 90+%. Typical paybacks are less than a year in retrofits, less than 0 in new builds. This is rarely taught or done because it's not a technology, it's a design method, and few people think of design as a path to speed and scale. But fully adopting such designs could save 1/5 of the world's electricity, or 1/3 by also adding 35 improvements to the motor systems while they're shrinking by about 5 or 10-fold. Making pump and fan rotors in novel shapes inspired by nature can also raise efficiency by about 20 or 30%. The super-efficient hydroelectric turbine, shown on the right, lets fish pass through unharmed. Other complementary innovations can make super-efficient propellers for boats, ships, and planes. The motors, too, keep getting smarter, more efficient, and in the past 5 months, shockingly lightweight. The British 1,000 horsepower wheel motor on the right produces 114% more peak power from 62% less weight than the previous model. That's an astonishing 59 peak kilowatts per kilogram to enable revolutionary electric road and air vehicles. Lighter, lower drag vehicles that can best use such motors are emerging too. Tesla's semi-electric truck, about to enter mass production, has 3 to 6 times the efficiency of the U.S. diesel heavy truck fleet. This quiet, double-range diesel air taxi can fly from Tokyo to San Francisco using 1/8 the fuel of a typical business jet, with bigger and hydrogen and transonic variants on the way. These planes' superlaminar aerodynamics can scale to probably 737 size and could blow up aviation's business models. And coming next are airplanes made of tough, strong lattice and membrane structures, 59 times less dense than a typical metal aircraft wing. Eliminating movable flight surfaces, every part of the whole shape passively adapts to optimize continuously for real-time flight conditions, just like a bird's wing. This opens revolutionary prospects for lightweighting, aerodynamics, and cost reduction. Combining all the proven improvements, my grandsons may fly all solar-powered airliners across the Pacific. The electric plane story is just like the electric car story a quarter century later. Already, 2 light and sleek electric hypercars are ready to enter the market as soon as they finish raising production capital. They get 107 to 146 kilometers per liter equivalent, 2 or 3 times more efficient than a Tesla. So the solar cells on top can capture enough energy for normal driving without plugging in. Mercedes now sells a car similar to the one on the right, getting 100 kilometers per liter equivalent. So to summarize, today's energy debates are mainly between 2 paradigms: growing energy supplies on the left, mostly fossil fuels, and the climate risk of burning them, shown in the aqua second graph. But those stories miss 2 vital other stories. In the third graph, electrotech displaces fuels with renewable electricity. As Thomas described, that automatically saves the currently wasted half to two-thirds of all primary energy now used, worth $500 billion a year, and it reshapes geopolitics as America strives to become a petrostate, China an electrostate. But the story is still all about supply. The fourth graph combines renewable electricity with efficient use. Integrative design then flattens and shrinks how much electricity we need to power the same thriving economy. That's the biggest missing piece of the puzzle, because practical, profitable, and proven integrative design methods, if fully applied, could make the global economy about 5 times more energy efficient over the next few decades. Much of this potential applies also to Japan, which has the capacity to lead this transformation if we can summon the will. So we have a huge efficiency potential, a short time, a country rich in renewable endowment, and a vast opportunity. Let's go forth, be fruitful, and subtract. And a great hyaku, finally, is rapidly emerging in other countries. 3/4 of Japanese people want it too. We know from Basho that Japanese frogs jump far, but we're still waiting for Mizuno Oto. So let's stop waiting and act. Which country, when it makes up its mind to do something new, can do it faster than anyone? Japan. Your government need only let and make energy markets work so your people's diligence and your industry skills can flourish. Let efficiency and renewables compete fairly, fully, and transparently. Remove the fine print that lets utilities block renewables from the grid. Create a truly independent national grid operator. Reward utilities for cutting customers' bills, not for selling more energy. Let willing utilities invest alongside customers and entrepreneurs, so they too can profit from change. Bust barriers, embrace innovation. Let all ways to save or produce energy compete fairly, regardless of their type, technology, size, location, and ownership. These choices could boost Japan's prosperity, influence, and security. Japan could lead the world in reinventing fire, shifting from an energy source that has brought immense suffering to Japan to relying on the sacred sun on your nation's flag. Just needs your people's choice and your devoted effort. Thank you for your good work and your kind attention. Gosecho makito ni arigatou gozaimashita.
Thank you, Mary. At the end, you gave some good advice of what to do. And one of the challenges with your optimism, or what should you say, constructive attitude to the utilization of new technologies, is that you have been able to describe such potential technology improvements for decades, and you have become right in predicting they will be used. It's just that it takes 10, 20 years instead of 1 year. What are the blocking factors?
I think the most important one in Japan is that the government, the national government, not all the prefectural and local ones, seems to think that its responsibility is to protect the incumbents as if our job were to protect the old energy system rather than enable the new energy system. I think this is a misunderstanding of what is in the best interest of the Japanese people.
Thank you. Rebecca, next you are the expert on the global and Asian wind power development. Please take the floor. Tell us.
Thank you, Thomas, and ohayo gozaimasu, minasan. It's fantastic to be here again with friends. I've been coming to this conference now for some years, and every year it gets better. Every year there's more people here, and it's a really exciting opportunity. I wanted to start today by paying tribute to REI and congratulating them on the occasion of it being the 15-year anniversary. So thank you to Thomas, to Ono-san, to Obayashi-san, And thank you to the whole team for putting on this conference. You've been leading the conversation around the energy transition in Japan and pushing the Japanese view of the energy transition globally for some time now, and it's fantastic to see the impact you've been making. And then, in addition, I just wanted to say, on the occasion of it being International Women's Day earlier this week, a huge thank you to Obayashi-san and to the whole powerful contingent of women that work at REI for their mentorship and leadership on the agenda of diversity as well. So thank you so much. Okay. Big round of applause. Thank you. So today I want to talk to you about wind power and emerging global trends that we're seeing at the moment in the sector. I'm going to start by looking at these global trends, and then also by looking at the status of global wind power before moving on to some recommendations about how Japan can seize the opportunity for wind. So there's a little bit of detail here about GWEC, but just as a recap, since I've been to this conference quite a few times now, hopefully you are familiar with the organization, but we're the Global Industry Association for the wind power sector. We also have a few sister organizations that we helped create, including the Global Renewables Alliance, which is a cross-industry effort bringing together the solar power industry, the wind power industry, hydropower, storage industry, and the geothermal industry in order to put forward a cross-renewables view of the energy transition. So coming on first to the moment that we find ourselves in 2026. And I mean, for everyone who's been reading the news lately, it's clear that there's a lot happening out there in the world. First of all, I just wanted to touch on some of the themes that have already been raised by Thomas and by Amory, and thank you for your excellent presentations. But we find ourselves now truly in the age of electricity. You can see here a slide which illustrates the IEA scenarios. The IEA were the first ones to have coined this term, I believe, age of electricity. And what is clear is that electricity is growing faster than all other energy sources. And as we see, the way that we're now going to power our homes, we're going to drive our cars, the way we're interacting with this digital era is rapidly changing, and electricity is becoming absolutely central to that change and to that journey. And as Thomas shared earlier, I mean, the good news is that it is absolutely clear, looking at all the scenarios out there, despite what you hear from some people out there in the media or in the world, renewables are the technologies that are pushing forward this era of electricity. So it's a really exciting moment, and we start to see countries really emerge, as Amy was saying, of being electrostates rather than petrostates, really making electricity the cornerstone of their approach. And the reason that they're doing this, as Thomas was saying, is because now, coming into this era, it's going to be the countries that have those natural resources in terms of wind, in terms of sun, which are going to benefit from the next stage of this global transition, not just an energy transition, but an economic and social transition. Okay, so that's the electrostate revolution. The other huge mega trend that we're seeing is an age of extreme geopolitical uncertainty and multipolarization and the breaking down of the world order. I'm sure that many of you followed the speech that Mark Carney gave at Davos around this theme of emerging middle powers, but also of the rupture. The old world has broken apart and is changing, and we really need to look at what's happening in front of us and respond to the reality that we're seeing. Sorry, the clicker is a little bit slow, I think. There we go. If you've kept up with the news over the past few days, and it's been difficult to keep up, I agree, what we're now starting to see is that many countries around the world are having to take extreme measures to try and reduce the risk that they're exposed to now from the uncertainty and from the war in the Middle East. So some examples here of things that have just happened yesterday, where we have countries responding to cap electricity usage, cap oil usage, and also to try and reduce their demand very quickly, leading to huge impacts on the economies of these countries. And looking at the situation in terms of Japan, as others have said, Japan finds itself in a fairly critical situation, I would say, because it is so exposed to fossil fuel imports through the Strait of Hormuz. We can see here, and I'm sure other speakers will expand on this further, the extreme dependence that Japan has on imported fossil fuels. And if we look at Japan's geopolitical uncertainty when it comes to key shipping routes and key flashpoints, you can see that the Strait of Hormuz is only one geopolitical flashpoint area of many here listed on the right that could affect Japan's ability to continue to be so reliant and dependent on imported fossil fuels. So bearing that in mind, I mean, what can wind power do globally, but also in relation to Japan, to try to de-risk this trend and to really offer a solution to the problem that we're seeing here? So just looking at the strategic value of wind when it comes to energy security, hopefully I don't have to tell you all that wind energy is hugely scalable. It has high capacity factors. In Japan, capacity factors could range from about 35 to 45%, so providing this variable baseload power that is needed in order to drive forward large-scale power. Also, wind is competitive, and looking at comparisons with fossil fuel imports, not only will it reduce exposure to these external shocks, but also wind power prices are predictable once you sign the contract. You can rely on the price that you will achieve. Every mature market for offshore wind in particular has witnessed significant cost reductions at about 2 to 3 gigawatts of build out of offshore wind. Japan finds itself at the cusp and at a critical point when it comes to offshore wind power build out. This can be a huge opportunity for Japan. Japan is blessed with world-class wind resources. I mean this truly. It is one of few countries that have the huge opportunity to unlock wind at scale in this way. But there are some decisions that need to be made over the next few months in order for Japan to really capture that reality. You can see here that even in 2022 prices, 1 gigawatt wind farm alone would have avoided $928 million of imported gas costs per year. So you can imagine on the current basis of oil prices and looking at the current geopolitical uncertainty, what 1 gigawatt of wind could do, let alone 30 gigawatts as per target. And just maybe a word on this slide. I think the lessons are already out there in terms of this international experience. I know that we have some speakers here maybe later who will draw on examples and lessons from the Iberian example that was already given. But what we can see here clearly is that in Spain, for instance, Spain has had the lowest exposure to this fossil fuel price volatility because it is in Europe, because it has already upscaled its renewable component very significantly. So it's managed to essentially decouple from the risk that we're seeing. And what we're now witnessing is that countries are moving in this direction. In real time, we've got some examples here, but just last week, the president of South Korea gave an address where he was talking about the fast tracking of renewables as being a solution to the challenge that we're seeing at the moment. We saw the Egyptian government come out with an emergency response package, 2.5 gigawatts of renewable capacity just in the next year that they intend to build out in response to these challenges. We've seen in the last 24 hours, I believe, Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the UK come out and push forward a package of measures to increase renewables deployment. And then we've also seen the Philippines responding to try and bring forward more options when it comes to renewables. And then also we've seen huge private companies such as Microsoft saying that this moment in time, the war in the Middle East really strengthens the case for renewables and for wind power because of the importance of reduction of risk. So just maybe a word on what we're doing at GWEC on this topic. You may be familiar with some of the reports that we've done on the topic of global supply chains over the last few years. Indeed, we started this work in around 2020, mapping out the global supply chain for wind, including to a component level and looking at key commodities such as steel. We did a seminal report a few years ago, which then analyzed different trade scenarios when it comes to the impact that those trade scenarios could have on our ability to deploy wind in line with targets. And no surprises, what we found was that free and open trade is the only scenario under which we are able to deploy in line with targets. The world right now is quite far away, I think it's fair to say, from a free and open trade scenario. So we'll continue this analysis, we'll continue our advocacy to bodies like the WTO also, and try to uphold routes and opportunities to enforce the rules-based order and to continue to monitor this situation. So that was looking at the global megatrends that we see, and now coming specifically to the topic of what's happening with the wind sector globally. A question for the audience. Where is this wind farm? You can shout out in English or Japanese, as you prefer. Where is this wind farm? Thank you, it's in China. In fact, there are 4 turbines that you can see here. Those are just 4 of 225,000 wind turbines that have been built in China. President Trump at Davos famously said that China doesn't build any wind turbines at all, but the facts speak for themselves. And in this next section, I want to give you the facts so that you understand that the situation with wind power might not be what you've heard. So actually, what we have found is that for 2024, which is the last year that we have a full data set for, so this is looking back at that period. 2025. For 2025, which is the last year that we have a full data set for, actually the wind industry is growing at an accelerated rate. It will be another record year when it comes to the deployment of wind. And we will go to 150 gigawatts per year. 150 gigawatts, yes, per year in 2025. So the growth trajectory is there for all to see. You may have heard that wind is not growing, that it's a failure, whatever. This is rubbish. Actually, the facts speak for themselves, and wind power is growing exponentially. So that leads me to say, you can try to bend the truth, but you cannot bend the laws of physics and economics. The unfavorable headlines are there, but the numbers are speaking here for themselves. And as we said, 90% of new power installations last year were renewables, and wind is playing a huge role, a strong role within that. So looking at some examples here of what's happening out there. In China last year, at the end of October, the Chinese industry signed the Beijing Declaration, which sets out that for the next 5 years in China alone, the wind industry will install 120 gigawatts of wind per year in China for the next 5 years. We've also seen rapid growth happening in India, which had last year another record year when it comes to wind power installations. Again, despite what you've heard from the US, actually we have seen substantial deployment and record installations of wind in the US in the last year, despite all the negativity and noise. And then we're also seeing some key aspects of progress when it comes to regulatory issues such as grid management, intelligent market design. In Europe, at the beginning of this year, in 2026, we saw record auction results from the UK allocation round 7, the biggest ever auction for wind that there's been, 8.4 gigawatts of power procured in that auction. We also saw a group of North Sea countries coming together to collaborate on pushing forward offshore wind. The North Sea Declaration on Cooperation for Wind Power then commits this group of North Sea countries to deploying 14 gigawatts of wind a year alone, which is really exciting from a supply chain perspective because it means that companies and investors can invest on that basis of yearly deployment. And then we're also seeing some positive examples from places like Germany when it comes to the topic of permitting reform. We're also seeing now another tranche of different markets pushing forward wind power at scale and really a new set of emerging markets pushing forward regulatory design and movement to deploy more wind power. So that leads me to say that the outlook for wind at a global level is a lot more optimistic than it was when I sat here last year and talked about the situation with the global wind power industry. We've actually raised our market outlook. We're about to bring out our global wind report for this year in April at the Wind Europe conference. And what we have said is that we're actually pushing up our forecast by 8.8% compared to different forecasts that we've had previously. So actually, it's an exciting moment where there's huge growth coming. And despite, as I say, what you might have read, actually, the situation with wind power globally is very promising and is moving forward quite nicely. Just a moment to touch on offshore wind. So for offshore wind, last year we saw 11 gigawatts installed. You can see here the breakdown between China, Europe, and then Asia ex-China. I think it's fair to say, though, that that's a moment in time that was for last year, and that has been quite severely affected also by the US situation. Going forward, what we're starting to see is countries such as Vietnam, the Philippines, hopefully Japan and South Korea also bringing more capacity online when it comes to offshore wind. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move quite quickly through these slides. But looking at some of these positive examples from the Asia regional context, I just wanted to pause and talk a little bit about what's happening in other countries in the region. So we've seen lots of rapid movements in South Korea when it comes to the passage of the one-stop-shop permitting bill, the establishment of a new climate ministry, and then, as I said, this recent package of measures to push forward renewables and to push forward wind power. We're doing a lot of work in Japan with our country manager, Matsuki-san, who sat in the audience here today, on how the industry can help push forward a promising new approach, I think, to offshore wind following the withdrawal of Mitsubishi from the round one auctions. We're also then seeing a rapid growth in both the Philippines and Vietnam. Both these countries have substantial economic growth ambitions and are power hungry. So there's an exciting opportunity to now push forward the next stage of regulations to make sure that both the Philippines and Vietnam continue their strong momentum. The Philippines just launched its first ever offshore wind auction at the end of last year. Really exciting moment. And later this year in June, we'll be holding an APAC conference in Hanoi, which is really looking at the opportunity for wind in Vietnam and is supporting the government in its ambitions there to push forward wind in Vietnam. So, to conclude the presentation, what are our predictions and what do we see, both from a global perspective and then coming to the opportunity in Japan? Well, we believe that the wind industry is going to be flourishing long after the current US administration. We're going to outlast President Trump, and he can say whatever he likes, but the facts that I've just presented speak for themselves. So unfortunately, I think this is all about the US then, after that period, having to catch up with what the rest of the world is doing. We also see that the European Commission has really ambitious plans to address some of the barriers that the industry has been facing, and I think that their approach over the next period will hopefully provide some good opportunities and some good learnings and lessons. In Asia, we're seeing many countries, as I just set out, really rapidly moving forward with reform of their systems in order to bring on more wind power. And then looking at some of those specific barriers, we are seeing progress on key issues like grids and on permitting. Whilst grid is a problem everywhere, I think there is collective learning which is now being undertaken on the topic of how to enhance transmission systems and grids. And then also we're seeing a new paradigm when it comes to economics and supply chain issues. And actually, there's a lot that we need to unpack in this particular period. But the opportunity for diversification for countries is there. And we hope to be able to support countries looking to do this with the vast body of evidence and data that we now have on the topic of the wind supply chain. So what does this mean for Japan, and how can Japan seize the wind opportunity that I've set out here and also that Thomas set out in his presentation? We actually published a white paper very recently, and again, just doing a little shout out to Matsuki-san, who's in the audience here, for his hard work on this. We also have a forum coming up later this week where we'll bring together the wider Japanese industry to talk about how we push forward a longer term view of wind power in Japan. There are some specific recommendations set out in the white paper around how the government and how METI can move forward with potential reforms of the Japanese system in order to bring forward more wind power. I won't go into those right now because we don't have time, but I do urge you to read that document, and we're very happy to answer further questions on that this week. So, in conclusion, a really exciting opportunity that Japan has in front of it. Now is the time, with all the geopolitical uncertainty that we see, and also the prize of the electro state and electro tech revolution that's been outlined by different panelists today. It's all to play for, and the opportunity is Japan's. Thank you very much. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that, which I should describe as wind power optimism based on real facts and data. We now go on to Ali, who is, as I said, head of Asia Pacific for Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and who will give us an overview with even more data.
Thank you very much, Thomas. 皆様おはようございます。ご紹介使いました。
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction. I think I should switch to English.
It's my great pleasure to share with you analysis my colleagues around the world do on energy transition. Apologies. Right. And I really appreciate the opportunity from Renewable Energy Institute to speak to you today. Being the last panelist, I have the privilege of reinforcing the messages that my fellow panelists already shared with you, while at the same time having the advantage to highlight some of the risks that we see. And in some cases, apologies, I will probably seem more pessimistic than my fellow optimist panelists. But let's start on an optimistic note. If you look at annual investment globally in energy transition, the good news is last year we hit a new record, $2.3 trillion US. That's the good news. We have seen tremendous amount of investment in energy transition. And the numbers you see on the screen, these are not promises for the investment, these are actual financial flows. Now, if we dig deeper by sector, the bulk of the investment is still going to technologies that are mature and are very economically competitive. So out of that $2.3 trillion, over $2.1 trillion went into renewable energy, energy storage, electrified transport, as well as investment in power grids. On the other hand, technologies such as hydrogen and carbon capture and storage are still getting relatively limited amount of investment. And as Thomas alluded in his opening, nuclear is also still treading water, despite the fact that we see a lot of headlines and a lot of talk of small modular reactors and even fusion. If we now look at the investment in just energy supply and compare the amount of investment that has gone into clean supply versus fossil fuel energy supply, since 2023, the amount of investment going to clean energy supply has exceeded that of fossil fuels. That's the good news. And last year, that ratio reached a new high of 1.1, meaning that for every dollar invested in fossil fuel energy supply, we saw $1.1 invested in clean supply. This is the good news. Now, another area that has been getting a lot of attention is, of course, data centers. And it's certainly true that we are seeing significant growth in investment in deployment of data centers. Last year, the capital allocated to data centers exceeded over $440 billion. And based on current plans under construction, we expect that number to reach over $700 billion. If we put these numbers in context, in comparison to energy transition sectors, yes, it is true that if we compare it individually with solar or with wind, the investment is exceeding. But if we compare that number with the cumulative investment in renewable energy is still a bigger sector. Similarly, the annual value of electric vehicles sold is still exceeding the investment that goes into data centers. The other important point is that if appropriate policy measures are used, as Amory already showed us earlier, data centers can actually be a friend to energy transition. These new loads can actually accelerate deployments of renewable and energy storage, provided we have the right regulations, particularly on the power market design. Now, what about geographical distribution of the investment? Since 2013, the Asia-Pacific region has led the world in investment in energy transition. The bulk of that role has been driven by China, which since 2013 has been the largest single market for energy transition. But it may be a little bit difficult on this chart to see. You will notice that the annual investment in China slightly declined in 2025. If you just look at China's investment, yes, it's certainly true that in 2025, the $800 billion invested was lower than the number we saw in 2024. And if you look at it by sector, the largest decline was in renewable energy investment. Now, this may be surprising, as we already heard in earlier presentation, China continued to add a record amount of new renewable capacity. So why did the investment go down? Part of it is the good news. Equipment gets cheaper, and particularly in China, equipment prices continue to decline. For wind turbines in particular, while in the rest of the world we saw actually wind turbine prices slightly rise in 2025, in China they continue to decline. And then the decline in solar and battery prices is basically driven by what Chinese manufacturers have been doing. So for every dollar, you're getting more capacity basically. Now, there's also a development that in the short term will certainly be negative for renewable capacity additions, but in the long term, it will have benefits. And that's the fact that China has accelerated its power market reform agenda. Previously, China planned to expose renewable energy to more wholesale market competition by 2029. Early last year, they decided to accelerate that timeframe by 5 years. And what that has meant is that for renewable energy developers and investors, there's a lot of uncertainty that they're trying to grapple with, meaning the amount of new projects that would be deployed in the coming years, including this year, particularly for 2026, some of those projects would have been financed in 2025, in the second half of 2025. So certainly there was a decline there. And you can see that our forecast for China is showing that for the next 5 years, we're expecting annual additions to be below that of the record additions that we saw in 2025. But let's put these numbers in context. The over 350 gigawatt of solar and wind capacity additions that we expect in China in a single year, this is larger than the entire Japanese power system. So yes, it's a bit of a decline from the record we saw last year, but it's still a tremendous amount of renewable capacity that China is going to be deploying. It's also important to remember that, yes, it's true that China has added more coal capacity, but coal annual generation in 2025 declined. And for the first time ever, we may be at a point that we're seeing an emission decline globally outside of a financial crisis. And hopefully, if hydro generation can hold, which is somewhat weather dependent, this means China has probably already reached peak emission, which means the world has reached peak emission. Now, to be fair on this point, I want to be cautiously optimistic. This is going to be very much dependent on weather. It's certainly true that before 2030, China will reach peak emissions, which means the world will reach peak emissions. If we look at China's investments in energy transition as a share of GDP, it's already at a record high of 4%. If you compare that to that of Japan, Japan is still stuck below 1%. For comparison, Saudi Arabia, one of the largest fossil fuel producers in the world, last year, its investment in energy transition accounted for 2.5% of GDP. For reference, the amount of money that Japan spends every year on fossil fuels, of course, depends on what commodity prices are and what the exchange rate is, at a minimum has been 3 times this number. And actually, in some years, it can be more than 6 times this number. Now, The good news is that Japan did have a good year in 2025. You can see investment did jump, and renewables in particular had a good year, partly because there were a few large projects that got financed. But you can see that for renewables, the 2025 number is still well below that of 2020. And in terms of capacity additions, the growth in renewable capacity additions in Japan peaked over 10 years ago, unfortunately, which, to be fair, was driven by overly generous feed-in tariffs. And more concerning is that Japan is the only OECD country to see annual electric vehicle sales actually decline. So Japan is really falling behind on increasing electrification of final energy use. If you look at the changes that have happened over the last 15 years, yes, we should acknowledge that Japan did add a lot of renewable capacity. That's the good news. And I do want to commend Renewable Energy Institute for all the efforts that they put in trying to improve regulations that were holding back renewables. So a lot of credit does go to the Renewable Energy Institute for driving the changes that have happened. Unfortunately, though, these changes are still not enough. If you look at, as a reference, the progress that the UK made over the last 15 years, it's remarkable. Back in 2010, combined renewable electricity generation in the UK was just around 7%, actually lower than that of Japan at that point. Last year, the UK got almost half of its electricity generation from renewables alone. The UK has virtually quit coal power. Now, the UK has a lot of issues as well. I don't want to say that the UK is a perfect example, but it shows you how an island country, the favorite term that's used here in Japan, can make progress in energy transition by adopting the right policies. By the way, for wind, we already heard Japan does have a lot of good wind resources. Some may argue that the UK is more windy, but actually, if you look at the actual data, Japan has significant potential. For solar, Japan right now is still ahead of the UK, but actually, if you look at the current trends, by the end of this decade, the UK will have more solar generation than Japan. I'm sure most of you have been to London. This is, so it's really unfortunate, and I apologize for raising this because it is rather frustrating, to be very honest, to see Japan, which has a very, very good solar installation, a country that used to lead also in solar manufacturing. I started my career when Sharp, Kyocera were leading the world in solar manufacturing, is now falling behind somewhere that doesn't produce any solar panels and basically it's considered one of the cloudiest places on Earth. The other issue is that this dependence on fossil fuels is a significant economic risk for Japan. Just as a reference point, I put out the yen-US dollar spot exchange rate over the last 15 years. This is in nominal terms. If you do it in real terms, it would be even worse. You can see that every time fossil fuel prices go up, the Japanese yen gets weaker. What that means, that's even doubly worse for Japan because you also have to buy those fossil fuels in dollar terms. The reason that we see a lot of concerns in terms of financial shocks to the Japanese economy is primarily because of this dependence. If you look at across Asia Pacific and what the impact of the challenges that are happening as a result of the increased conflict in Middle East, you can see that the only market that's relatively protected is actually mainland China because it has increased the share of electrification in final energy use, while at the same time has tried to increase the reliance on renewables and other indigenous energy supplies that reduces its dependence on imports. Of course, China also still has challenges and needs to go further, but without having done that, China would have also been very, very exposed. If you look at across the Taiwan Strait, the island of Taiwan is actually much more exposed, not because it's an island, but because it hadn't taken the same pace of transition that China had done over the last 15 years. Amory already highlighted this point earlier. When it comes to energy security debates, it's very important to differentiate between consumable goods and capital goods. Again, it's very frustrating to hear politicians talk about import dependence for solar modules and inverters on a single country. When you buy a solar module or an inverter or energy storage or wind turbine, during the economic life of that capital good, the amount of imports you will need is negligible. Even if you build an internal combustion engine vehicle locally here in Japan and deploy it, throughout the lifetime of that vehicle, you have to import fuel. Even if you deploy a Japanese-made gas turbine or steam turbine, the coal or LNG that you will need to run that turbine, you will have to import that throughout its lifetime. So this is something that unfortunately is not being acknowledged, and it's very, very important if you're thinking seriously about improving your energy security. The point that renewables have become cheaper has already been made throughout the panel. Since 2017, the global benchmark, including taking into account financing costs and all other costs associated with a power plant, show that renewables have been much more effective. And increasingly, the levelized cost of electricity storage using battery energy storage system is now favoring those over, for example, using gas turbines. If you look by market, there are now already several both developed and developing economies where the levelized cost of electricity storage using batteries is below $100 per megawatt hour. This is not purely a China story. You can see even in markets such as Malaysia, we are already at that point. And we do expect costs to continue to come down. Here, I'm not showing you just the capital cost. I'm showing you expectations for, again, the levelized cost of electricity, both for generation and storage over the lifetime of the project. You can see for energy, battery storage, for offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, all of these, we still expect significant cost reductions globally. Now, the challenge is, despite these cost reductions, our base forecast for annual solar and wind capacity additions will grow at a lower rate than the remarkable growth that we saw between 2017 and 2024. The reason for this is not that solar and wind cannot be deployed faster. The reason for this is primarily the failure of power market design to keep up with technology improvement. Unfortunately, as we saw, for example, with the blackout in Spain, the challenge with having electricity systems that are running on higher shares of renewables is not a technology issue. It's an issue in not improving electricity system management, regulation, to keep up with taking advantage of what renewables and energy storage can provide. In the case of Spain, for example, voltage control was the main issue. There are already very, very cheap solutions using inverters to do voltage control. Now, a lot of times when we talk about high renewable systems, the old school power engineers would say, what about inertia? We need spinning mass. We need turbines in our system. You can today go buy energy storage systems that give you synthetic inertia. This is not theoretical. These systems are operating in the UK, actually operating in the Middle East. One of the big ones is actually in Saudi Arabia, also in Australia. But you have to have a power market design that actually supports their deployment. And in the end, they can lower your system costs. Despite the challenging power market design drawbacks, we still do see energy storage deployment accelerating in all markets. And of course, we do see electric vehicle deployment also accelerating, which will drive more demand for batteries and reduce their costs. We're also seeing significant innovation in long-duration energy storage across multiple different technologies. Here again, China is taking the lead, but also we do see activities in other markets as well. So this is not, again, just a China story. So if you put all this together, where are we going to go? Under our economic transition scenario, which doesn't consider our climate ambitions, and instead says, let's take into account what is already in force today and let the system evolve just purely on technology cost. The amount of investment increase that we would need in energy transition technologies is relatively modest. So you can see for the rest of this decade, we would have to have a 25% increase. If I were an optimistic person, I would say, oh, this is definitely doable because this is the year-on-year growth rate that we already saw, for example, from 2020 to 2023. But unfortunately, from 2023 to 2024, the year-on-year growth rate was only 11%. And last year, the year-on-year growth was only 8%. So we're seeing a deceleration in energy transition investment. And the problem with this, again, is not a technology issue. It's not that we don't have enough capital. It's basically a failure of policymakers. And then on the other hand, if you want to be aligned with what is required for Paris Agreement, we need to see significant jump in investment. And again, here, this is not an issue with lack of technology availability or funds. It's the issue that we don't have the right policies in place. If you look at Japan, Japan actually has one of the largest gaps. And as Amory also alluded to, again, this is unfortunately the shortcomings of policymakers. And more importantly, if you start looking at these numbers and compare them with the investments that we are already having to make to deal with climate damage, we're getting to the point that in some market, the investments required for recovery from climate damage is exceeding the amount that's going to mitigation. And of course, we have barely even touched adaptation and resilience. Thank you very much. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you. There was one country that had good reasons to celebrate yesterday, and that was Pakistan. Because they used the fact that China had overcapacity of solar PV manufacturing industries and they were selling solar panels cheaply, and Pakistan bought a lot of solar panels to the extent that the contracts they had for LNG deliveries were very much bigger than what they actually needed. So they are in the process of selling contracts for LNG deliveries. And when the prices went up, they must have had good reasons to celebrate. When you described how China would reduce the capacity installations in the coming years, wouldn't that be a remarkable opportunity for the rest of the world because they are still increasing their industrial capacity?
Yes and no. So you're absolutely right that certainly we have seen the intense competition among Chinese manufacturers and a slowdown in domestic demand result in more exports to other markets. And in the aftermath of Russia-Ukraine war, as Pakistan got priced out for buying LNG, certainly that then did result, as you said, in higher adoption of distributed solar and increasingly batteries in that market. It's certainly true that we're going to see exports from China rise, but unfortunately for other markets, their ability to absorb the excess capacity in China is somewhat limited. Again, it depends on whether you're an optimistic or pessimistic person. Certainly it's going to benefit in accelerating energy transition in emerging markets. But if you look at the scale of manufacturing capacity, particularly in the solar sector, the global manufacturing capacity for solar right now is way ahead of demand. And this is, of course, very painful for the manufacturers. This does require some structural adjustments where the Chinese government is trying to help. But it remains to be seen whether we can have a soft landing, to use the economist's word for it.
Amory and then Rebecca.
The optimist proclaims we live in the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist fears this is true. But let me pick up 2 points. One, China has already made an investment in clean technology manufacturing in other countries, totaling over $200 billion. It's bigger than the Marshall Plan, with which the U.S. rebuilt a lot of Western Europe after World War II, and will be, I think, similarly consequential, and will give Japan a lot more choices where to buy its solar panels from. Second, reinforcing your important point about cheap batteries, in Davos we heard from the Indian power minister that 3/4 of all the new firm capacity now being added in India is solar plus batteries.
And maybe just from me, a quick point on China. So that trend is absolutely there, but I think the other piece of the puzzle which isn't playing out yet in the numbers is also within China, this approach in terms of tightening regulations is now leading companies to seek more innovative solutions when it also comes to self-balancing, hybridization. There's this concept of what they're terming LCOV. It's kind of not really a translatable phrase, but the concept is that you kind of bring your own solution. And actually what we're seeing increasingly is manufacturers in China turning into developers and then exporting those solutions in partnership, so investing in countries, primarily looking at Latin America and Africa as two key places to do that, and also the Middle East and the STAN countries. So actually, I think whilst the numbers tell that story, this could actually be an opportunity for the rest of the world to then benefit from these hybridized systems and also from China's integrated learning when it comes to how to deal with higher penetrations of renewables.
One question to you, Rebecca. When you described the development in Japan, I think there were important factors you did not say anything about. From Europe, the experience is that to build offshore wind at low cost, you need scale and continuity. And when you talked about what was required here, you didn't say anything about any of those two variables. How do you see them playing out in Japan?
Well, my apologies, Thomas. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I did kind of mention this because when I talked about the points around cost, absolutely, it is about predictable, scalable volume. And it's not just the European example. I mean, China, another great example of where that predictable volume has enabled that cost reduction. So the challenge with Japan at the moment is, whilst the targets have been set for offshore wind and auctions have been undertaken, there just hasn't been that confidence of that predictable, scalable volume coming in. And the problem for investors is then how do they see their return on investment, and how does supply chain invest on the basis of a plan which is not clear and has no clarity over when their investment would be returned. So absolutely the key for Japan is about firstly deploying the wind that it should be deploying. That's step one. And then secondly, definitely setting out those predictable long-term volumes to regain the confidence of investors.
Thank you. Last few seconds for Amory.
And if I were an investor, I would be very worried that the regional utilities in Japan are still allowed to curtail the competitors to their own legacy assets, namely solar and wind. They can refuse to accept these onto their grids at any time for any reason or no reason. This, of course, makes the offtake revenue unreliable and financing difficult or impossible and much more expensive. This is, I think, a deliberate obstacle allowing this to happen that is put in the way of renewables, contrary to official pronouncements that the government likes renewables, and particularly wind power, because as Thomas mentioned, its steady output makes it a formidable competitor to the existing coal, gas, and nuclear plants. Therefore, the existing utilities strongly resist it, and the government goes along with that to protect the utilities' finances, which I don't think is a proper responsibility of government. It should be for the utilities to run their business properly.
Okay, 10 seconds, Rebecca.
Yeah, just an optimistic take. I mean, Japanese companies, major industrials, have long been investing in wind power in other countries. So the opportunity and the knowledge is there, but now it just needs to come home to roost.
Right, thank you. Excellent conclusions with the important points coming back. Give them a great applaud for their contribution.
パネリストの皆様、ありがとうございました。どうぞご講談ください。
Thank you very much to the panelists. You are kindly requested to leave the stage. We would now like to move on to session number 2 with the frontlines of renewable energy developments across countries. We will be rearranging the stage, and once it's ready, we will start. Thank you.
お待たせいたしました。セッションに自然
Thank you very much. We will start session 2, the frontlines of renewable energy development across countries. I would now like to introduce the panelists to you. First of all, from Ms. Alison Reed from the Grattan Institute, Mr. Patrick Gratian from former German State Secretary of the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate. Next, Mr. Hugo Lucas, Director for Knowledge, New Business Models and Competitiveness, Institute of Diversifications and Savings of Energy, and Mr. Nathan Hoffman, Director of the Center for Global Sustainability, University of Maryland. Moderator will be Ms. Mika Obayashi, Director of Renewable Energy Institute. Over to you, Obayashi-san.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I am Obayashi. I am with the REI. Every year we have this international conference on the 11th of March, actually. This is the first time we are holding this conference on this day. In 2011, August, we established this organization, and since then, 14 times we organized this REvision International Conference, and this is the 14th, and this is the year 15. In retrospect, for the past 15 years, the energy policy of the countries and Japanese renewable situation has changed significantly. Among our researchers, 15 years ago, some people were going to elementary schools, so we are getting young. So in that sense, the 15 years of period is quite long in a sense. And during this period of 15 years, renewable energies was a peripheral resource, particularly in Japan, but it has grown to the mainstay in the energy policy cost and the introduction installed amount and the industrial policy and grids and battery storage and also relationship with local communities. There are many things that we have to discuss, expand actually, including security. And we have invited speakers from advanced countries when it comes to renewables. By learning experience from well-advanced countries, we would like to learn from their challenges and also their success stories as well. I think that will be very helpful for Japan going forward. And the current status and the challenges faced by Japan will be concentrated in the afternoon sessions. After 15 years, still we are in the middle of energy transition. Still, oil-related conflicts are continuing. We have made a progress. However, depending on countries, pace of the progress differ, and we are encountering new challenges one after another. Therefore, not only looking back at the history of 15 years, we want to consider how we are going to design what we want to do for coming 15 years. That's what we want to achieve in this session. First, I would like to invite the first speaker from Australia. We have Alison Reed.
Thank you very much, Obayashi-san, and thank you very much to the Institute for inviting me to this event. This is the first time I've attended, but it has a very good reputation. So everyone I spoke to about it told me that this would be a great event to come to. My job today is to talk a little bit about Australia's journey in the energy sector, some of the challenges that we're finding at the moment, and then some of the things that are facing us in the future. But before I start, I just want to give a quite quick overview of Australia's energy system, because I think this is important context for understanding everything that's playing out for us. Now, this is a very complicated picture. I don't expect you to read all of it, but I want to just draw your attention to a few parts of it. The first part is relatively, as you can see up the top here, how large Australia's energy exports are compared to the amount of energy that we consume. And what this tells you is that a lot of what happens in Australia is driven by the export industries, not by domestic consumption patterns. I also want to highlight how small the amount of electricity in our final energy consumption is. We consume far more so coal and gas and so on directly, and petrol, than we do electricity. And then I also want to highlight the size of the renewable part of this electricity mix compared to everything else that you can see. Everything that is happening in the Australian energy system at the moment is driven by either exports or emissions and the attempt to reduce emissions, or both of those together. Now, I want to talk about what's been happening in our electricity system. This is often held up as something that's a lot of other countries can learn on. If we look at the change in our emissions in Australia between 2005 and the present, the emissions from our electricity sector have fallen by nearly a quarter. This is a really great success story, and this has been because we have started to close down coal-fired power stations and we have built a lot of renewable capacity. At the same time, however, emissions from our other energy consumptions have gone up. The oil and gas sector has gone up by 89%. Our transport emissions have gone up, which is largely because of economic growth. And we've seen some small changes in other emissions that come from the energy sector, from consumption and production as well. When you take a broad view of energy and not just electricity, our overall energy emissions have moved by 1% since 2005. Now, for a country that is trying to get to net zero by 2050, that shows that we have a really long way to go. I did, however, want to talk about 3 success stories today, and these are the growth of renewables, the growth of rooftop solar, and the beginning of a renaissance in batteries. This is the picture in 2010 of where our electricity was coming from in what's called the NEM, the National Energy Market. This is the largest energy market in Australia. And as you can see here, it was very much dominated by coal and gas, a little bit of hydro, which had largely been built in the 1950s and 60s. And you can hardly see the solar at the top of that chart. We had 8.4% of electricity coming from renewables, and 0.06 of it was behind the meter. And this is how it has changed over time. And this is where we are today. In 2025, we had got our renewable share up to 48.5%, and 13.7% of our electricity is sitting behind the meter, which is effectively all rooftop solar. What you can see there is the coal is falling away. Some of that was coal-fired power stations shutting down. Some of that was just that they lose market share. They actually can't compete with the renewables, and so they are just not running as hard or as often. You can also see the large growth in utility solar there in particular, but also rooftop solar, and the beginning of the batteries starting to come into the mix as well. Just a little bit of rooftop solar. Around 35% of households in Australia have solar on the roof. That is up from around 3% in 2010. So that's around, I mean, Australia is a small country. That's, 3.7 million homes, but that is still around, 35% of households who have solar. The average size of rooftop solar has also grown a lot between 2010 and 2025. It was just under a kilowatt in 2010. It's now above 6 kilowatts. That's the average size, so there are a lot of systems that are larger than that. I know my next door neighbour has 10.6 kilowatts on his roof. Australian houses are very large, so we have room for 10 kilowatts on a roof. That's partly what has driven the large systems. I also said I would talk about batteries. So Australia put in its first grid-scale battery in 2017. This was a 100 megawatt battery. We've now got nearly 10 gigawatts of batteries, and we have a lot more in the pipeline as well. So these are the utility scale batteries that are attached to the transmission network or distribution network and act like generators in the market. The other thing that has started to grow a lot just over the last 6 months is household batteries. A lot of those homes who have rooftop solar are now thinking about why not put in a battery as well. Around 180,000 households have now put in those batteries. This has been driven by a government subsidy program, but the government has been surprised several times at how popular this has been. So there was a lot of latent demand there for a battery that just needed a subsidy to push it over the line. The very interesting thing that is happening with batteries is that batteries are starting to take away share of the electricity market from the gas generators. What you can see here is what has happened in the NEM, the big electricity market, and the WEM, which is the Western market. What has happened between this year and last year is that batteries have increased their average discharge in the evening peak by over a gigawatt, and gas has fallen by about the same amount. This is happening because there are more batteries. It is also happening because batteries are making most of their money from arbitrage, so they are finding cheap energy to charge up with during the day, and then they are sending it out at night when the prices are higher. The other thing that effect that has is that they set the peak price. So it used to be that when we tried to figure out what our electricity prices would be, you look at the gas, because the gas would always be the marginal generator, the generator that was the last one to dispatch to the market, and that meant whatever price it was demanding would set the electricity price. What has happened between 2024 and 2025 is that batteries have taken that role, and batteries have become the price setter. This will be very interesting for us going forward, because our market at the moment is it's an economic dispatch market based on the marginal cost of generation. When you move to batteries, you're not worrying about the marginal cost of generation anymore. You're thinking about the opportunity cost of storage. This means the decision that the batteries have to make we have a 5-minute dispatch period, so they have to make this decision every 5 minutes. Do I send the energy out now, or do I hold it back for another 5 minutes because the price might be higher in 5 minutes' time? We are still figuring this out. Perhaps someone can come back next year and tell you how it's going. Okay, I said I'd talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're facing at the moment. And I brought this down to 3 things that we are having to find a way through. One is how we manage the exit of coal-fired power stations. One is curtailment of renewables, and one is negative prices. So in this chart here, you can see the grey area is the rate of coal closure that we will need to achieve if we want to meet our emissions targets of reducing our emissions by 43% by 2030, and then also by 62% by 2035. I said we have to go faster, and also we have to go slower. And what you can see here is that we have, increased the rate at which we're taking coal out from 2021 back to 2024. It then moved. All of the coal sort of shifted forward again in 2025 because we had a change of government in one state who decided they wanted to keep the coal open for longer. The reason I say that we have to go slower is because the rate at which we're building renewables is not fast enough to replace that coal. And so we find ourselves in the odd situation where governments are funding new renewables to come in as fast as they can, but they are also making payments to the coal-fired power stations to ask them to stay open because they are worried about the lights going out. This is something where this is mostly about things like how fast we can approve renewables projects and so on, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But it is an odd paradox to find yourself in. A little bit about curtailment, and this is sort of goes to one of the reasons why we're not building renewables fast enough. Utility solar is starting to face, on average, quite high levels of curtailment of around 6% or so. That's the average. There are some that are facing much higher levels of that, so maybe 15 to 20% curtailment. It is very hard to go to a bank and ask to borrow money if you have to tell them that for 20% of the time you're not going to be able to sell your product. And so this is one of the things that is making it difficult for utility solar in particular to get financed. The reason that this impacts solar so much is because we have so much rooftop solar. The rooftop solar exporting all during the middle of the day actually drives us into negative price territory, which you can see on the right-hand side here. The percentage of time that we have negative prices in the market. Now, what is happening at that point is that there isn't enough demand to take all the electricity that wants to go into the market, and so the utility solar gets curtailed because its output is correlated with the rooftop solar. And one of the things that is, when you have a very high level of rooftop solar, is it becomes politically very difficult to curtail it. No politician is going to get re-elected on a platform of telling households that they can't sell their solar into the grid. Just very quickly, I'll talk about a couple of things for the future directions. The first one really is this: can we build the system that we need to build? We also need to think about whether the community will accept that rate of change, decide what the role of gas in our economy will be, and also think further about carbon pricing. To get to our emissions targets for 2050, we have to build an electricity system that is 3 times larger than the one we have now. You can see here the extra amount we need to build, somewhere between around 20 to 30 gigawatts every 5 years or so. The most we have ever built in a year of renewables is 5 gigawatts. So we need to figure out ways in which we can build a lot faster in order to be able to pull off getting the coal out of the system, getting some of the gas out of the system, and supporting large-scale electrification across the economy. One of the other issues that we have is that opposition to renewables is rising. This is particularly the case in rural communities where they are being asked to host transmission lines and to host wind turbines and solar farms in areas that were previously did not have an industrialised landscape. This has held up a lot of projects. It holds them up in the planning process. The overall impact of that is it then drives up the cost of those projects. If a project is delayed for 5 years, inflation is going to push up the cost of the project, and that then flows through to higher electricity prices. And households are getting tired of high prices. I'm going to disagree a little bit with Ali here, who earlier was saying Australia would be insulated from the Middle East the Middle East impact on our electricity prices. Because Australia is a big exporter of coal and gas are often the price setter for our electricity, when there is a jump in the international price of gas and electricity, our electricity prices go up. And this happened in 2020 as in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And households are pretty angry about this. Electricity prices have become a very hot button political issue. And for the government to keep pushing forward on renewables is becoming difficult because the mental shortcut that households have is that renewables are high priced and it is renewables that are pushing up the cost, even though that is not the case. It is gas that is pushing up our electricity prices. And this has not really clicked, I think, in most people's heads just yet. What this means is it's very challenging for governments to push the pace of building, because at the same time they're also having to spend a lot of time convincing the public that the road they are going down is also the cheaper road. The other thing that Australia hasn't really clarified is what is the role of gas. We use this line, you'll hear this coming out of the mouth of every politician in the country, but no one is willing to say how much gas, who is going to use the gas, where will they be, and how long will they keep using that gas for. Until we sort this out, we will not get an efficient build of gas infrastructure, and we will not have an efficient way of divesting from a lot of the gas infrastructure that we have at the moment. And so we will not get the right mix of renewables and gas going forward. The last thing I said I would talk about is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is another very hot button political issue in Australia. Several prime ministers lost their job over carbon pricing. It has become taboo to talk about it, but we are getting to the point where if we want to get the right mix of renewables, we need to do more than just push more renewables into the electricity system. We have to actively tell the coal and gas that they are no longer welcome and that they need to leave. One way to do that is with carbon pricing. Our work shows that if we don't have some form of carbon constraint in the electricity sector, just the pure economics of renewables will not push the coal out fast enough, and emissions will stay too high for too long. And lastly, I just wanted to say the biggest challenge that we've got is we have to do all of this in a country where climate change is hitting us hard. The cost of natural disasters in Australia is going up and up and up. Everything that we build in renewables, all the new transmission, all the new solar, all of the new wind turbines need to be able to cope with climate change, which means they will be more expensive to build. The picture that I have here is a picture of our national parliament that was taken in 2020 during what was called the Black Summer, when for about a period of 4 months, the entire east coast of Australia was on fire. During that time, in Canberra, which is where I live and where this picture was taken, we had the worst air quality in the world for 6 weeks. Our air quality was worse than Beijing and worse than New Delhi. I could see fires from my house that burned for weeks and weeks and weeks, that took out transmission lines, they took out solar farms, they took out wind farms. The reason we are doing all of this is so that this happens less often. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
アリソンさん、どうもありがとうございました。先ほどの
Thank you very much, Alison. In earlier session, Emery talked about open name. Simon Formsakot, my friend, introduced that to me. That is an energy chart he showed to me, and Australia's rapidly growing energy transition that was shared with me. Australia, in the country, the promotion of renewable is done, but on the other hand, LNG and others are being exported to Japan and other countries. Therefore, it is a supply of resources. These two roles you are playing, energy transition politics or the policy design, these two roles are affecting the policy design and also energy transition progress.
その通りでありまして、
I think there's two things at play here. One is the role that exports have on our electricity prices. The other thing, though, is that the policy support for the coal and gas sector has been falling over time because of that impact on electricity prices, but also because people are concerned about climate change. So one of the things that I think has been interesting in the growth of our renewables sector is that has also grown a constituency who have more of a stake in a bigger future for renewables. And what that has meant is that the weight of political influence has shifted. The renewables sector can now go to governments, and it is large enough to say, if the policy settings are not right, we will take our money out of Australia. We will take it somewhere else, and they are now getting large enough for that to matter politically. The other thing that the renewable sector has been able to point to is when it gets large enough, it becomes a creator of jobs, particularly construction jobs, and jobs in regional areas which typically have higher unemployment and fewer opportunities. So I think the lesson there is that if you can grow your renewable sector beyond a tipping point, it actually will start to get political influence and also, I think, more popular influence as well, which means that it then generates its own momentum to get larger.
ありがとうございます。それではドイツの
Thank you very much. We would like to turn to Germany now. Regarding Germany, Japan is following a German model like a feed-in tariff and also a feed-in premium that has been introduced in Japan. Therefore, German policies have been utilized for Japan too. And German is in a major transition period, so I want to turn to Patrick.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you to be here again in Japan, because it is always a great pleasure to discuss, especially the challenges of nuclear and renewables, both in Germany and Japan. So, where do we stand in Germany? We basically started in 2000, the renewables era, and it has been growing steadily ever since. And we have now some 58% of Germany's power mix being by renewables. And what you can see is obviously wind and solar are the large shares here. So they together make up some 45% of our power sector. Now, that took place at the same time as Germany phasing out nuclear, and that is a huge international discussion always. It was always a domestic discussion as well, and at the end, we finally shut down the last 3 power plants in April 2023. To be clear, because there was always a discussion, will Germany re-enter nuclear? A lot of people, a lot of politicians like to talk about nuclear fusion, and then they say, yes, maybe in the 2030s. And everyone in this room knows nuclear fusion is always coming 20 to 30 years. We've been saying that for the past 50 years. So my personal bet is this will consume a lot of research money. It will never take place. Now, the quick question is, has that been going towards coal? And this is the coal use in Germany, and it has been going steadily down, except for the years of the energy crisis after Russia invaded full-scale the Ukraine. And me personally, I was heavily involved in that time, as I was the state secretary who suddenly had to tell coal power plants that they should not shut down. Because they were originally planned to be shut down in 2022. And essentially what we did is we extended the lifetime of several coal power plants for 18 months. So we told them, yes, you can continue to be used until March 2024. But that ended then in March 2024 because the energy crisis was over. So what you see here is that in 24 and 25, we have again continued our downward trend in coal. And that is going to continue as renewables grow and the CO2 price hits. So the greenhouse gas emissions in Germany have been going down, and we are now, that's 2025, at some nearly 50% below 1990 levels. The good news is that we have reached that and that it is going to continue to fall. The challenge is that it's not falling fast enough for our 2030 targets. So more needs to be done to get those 2030 targets. And just wanted to, I'll come on that later. Now, what are the recent developments? What we have been doing basically in the last 4 years? Solar is now booming, and we have basically tripled solar installations. And one part of it is balcony solar. What we did was basically make that very easy. Balcony solar is now very cheap. I mean, it's just a module and a little inverter, and you can go now to the home market and buy it for 300 euros. And then you just take the plug and plug it into your electricity device in your home. That's it. It took me, I think, 10 sessions with the installer installation and everything association in Germany to convince them that this is possible, that this would not blow up the whole electricity and would be safe and everything. At the end of the day, I always said, you know, this is, they have 1 kilowatt of size. So this is about as a water boiler. That also has 800 watts typically, or 1 kilowatt even. I mean, this is nothing that you're not having every day in your home and use, but it is just the other direction. So we convinced it, and it's now used everywhere. We have rooftop solar, which is now almost always matched with storage. So that is a bit similar to Australia. The thing, what we don't have is the large-scale batteries coming in. And that is because our grid companies haven't accepted the new challenge of storage yet. They see the storage as being another distortion to their grid. They don't see the advantages that it really gives to the grid. And of course, if it's playing just by market rules, it might increase grid stress. And so that is our key challenge. So we have a lot of storage now behind the meter. We have very little storage that actively participates in the market. And now another thing what was basically successful in the past years is that we increased and accelerated wind permitting. Basically, it took around 5 to 6 years to get a wind projects from the idea to the installment, and we cut that by half. And a large part of it was getting the permit process down to something that is done within 9 months. That was also a lot of sessions we had there. And now we have 20 gigawatts of just wind permits that have been issued last year. So while you were saying, is it possible to increase the renewables installation rate 3 to 4-fold? Yes, it is. But it is tedious work. Because sitting down with all those people, and I had to sit down with nature conservationists saying, but we need to map every windmill and all the birds that fly there. And then we sat down, I said, no, not for every windmill, we'll do that for a region. And once we did that for a region and have identified that in this region it is okay, then we're not going to do it again with every wind farm. But that was a huge change of culture for those people. So it is about finding a new approach. It's not about getting rid of nature conservation, but it's rather about let's not have that fight at every wind farm. Let's have it once we define where we put those wind farms. So this will then hopefully also lead to an increase of the wind installations this year to some 7 gigawatts because now all the permits are there. Now, let's go to the challenges. This is trying to depict where we have our emission reductions. And we have them, as you can see on the left-hand side, the reductions are in dark. We have them in energy, and we passed the target in energy. but we are not close to those targets in buildings, and we're not close to those targets in transport. And that has a very, and we need to double our energy system and renewables, just like Australia, based on renewables and electrification, if we want to meet our targets. Now, the challenge is really electrification. This is the heating systems that have been installed, and then basically the blue area up above is gas boilers. And gas boilers are heating 50% of our homes. Gas is the challenge. The green part is the heat pumps, and they are now, in 2025, for the first time, more heat pumps were sold than gas boilers. But that is a long way to go until you finally have almost all homes heated by heat pumps. And there is the challenge that the new government is now backtracking on the heating law, which will be a problem for moving into more electrification in the heating sector. And when it comes to our transport sector, also the electrification rate of new cars, so it was some 18% in 22 and 23. It dropped because the subsidies were gone down to 14%. We still have to put in the numbers here. In 2025, it was back up at 19%, and currently the first months in 26 are at 20%. Now, it is very clear that electric cars are the future. Also for Japan to note, hydrogen cars will never be competitive with electric cars. Just you know, Toyota should pick up, please. But of course, I mean, we have countries in Europe like Norway where we are close to 100%. In Denmark, it is 75%. In the whole Scandinavian region. So it is a shame that Germany is still lacking behind and only at 20%. And we could have more. And of course, that is a challenge to the German car manufacturing industry, which has been too slow to put forward electric models. And the next thing is, what do we do in those months when there is neither wind nor sun? We will establish a capacity market. And of course, the question on the design of a capacity market is it going to favor just gas power plants, or is it going to be technology open so that batteries participate and win? And we have a distribution grid that is the bottleneck today. So this is about curtailment. We do have a regime where currently curtailment is still financed, but that is now challenged. And the distribution grids are not basically being built fast enough to get all those additional renewables into the system. So that is a new challenge. Now, obviously, also building the grid just to the last kilowatt hour is not efficient. So what is the optimal curtailment? What is the optimal curtailment regime? Is, I think, something we in the renewables sphere still have to also contribute to that debate and find solutions. So there is a lot going on in this year. We'll have a reform of the Renewable Energy Act. We have a new grids regulation. We'll have a reform of the heating law. We have a proposal for the capacity market coming up. And the challenge will be here, will it be renewables and electrification friendly, or will it be gas friendly? Will we have more solar, electric cars and heat pumps, or is that going to slow down? In essence, I think it will continue, but the question is, of course, the speed. Thank you.
I will speak in Japanese, so you need a headset. Yeah.
Earlier in the beginning, nuclear power plant phasing out was mentioned, and for instance, in Japan, Germany has phased out coal and nuclear, and also energy transition itself is becoming more difficult economically, some people say. Particularly, some people want to go back to nuclear. The chancellor made a comment, such and such, going back to nuclear, according to the media. What was the major and biggest lesson you learned? Is it a choice of technology, or is it a grid or flexibility, or where did you find challenges mostly, and that is why you are facing a difficulty in moving to the next stage?
Yes, so when you sometimes have politicians that keep talking about nuclear, and it's a bit like the phantom pain when you have lost maybe something, part of a finger, and you still feel basically the pain of that finger, which doesn't exist anymore. That is a bit, it is not going to come back. The story is over. And the good news about that is that you can now spend all your brain thinking about the future, because you're not talking anymore and you're not having those debates anymore about that technology. Now, the future does have some challenges, and that is all around grids. We need to define how we build the grids faster. We need to find solutions about how do we make a market mechanism. Do we need more decentralized markets because there are grid bottlenecks and the market is still having a picture of a whole of Germany? Do we maybe need to go, and that's for just the nerds here, go to nodal pricing? Do we need to basically find local prices, and how do we then manage that there is not that there is still competition in those small markets? So that next level. So we are at nearly 60% renewables. If you want to go to 80 and plus, I think that interface of grids and markets, and how much grids do we need? What can storage do, and how is the market around that? That is, I think, the challenge ahead, and we will probably have a few other countries in the world that are actually at the same level when it comes to wind and solar, that will have the same issues. And among those, we need to share knowledge and insights. What is the best regulatory model?
Thank
you very much. Next, I would like to invite a speaker from Spain. Japanese people are familiar with the examples and cases of Germany. We have been taking up them repeatedly, but I understand there is a major energy transition going on in Spain. So, Hugo, I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, I would like to start to thank you for the kind invitation to the Renewable Energy Institute, and also to congratulate Thomas, Mika, and all the team for the 15 years of great work. Okay, I'm showing here of the last 15 years, but it's also true that nothing really relevant happened in 2010 in Spain. So afterwards, more of the figures that I'm going to show you is the energy transition in Spain for the last 8.5 years, because in 2018, the government changed it, and the government positioned energy transition in the top of the agenda. Nevertheless, if we look to the 15 years, we see one thing that in terms of generation, it was also shown in the beginning by Patrick, we are consuming less electricity. I think it will take us a full revision conference to discuss about the challenges of electrification and the future of electrification. Already mentioned, Patrick, some of these challenges, but the real thing is that we are consuming less electricity when we have policy for electrification. So, of course, energy efficiency is overtaking an increase in new uses of electricity. What happened with nuclear, it has decreased the absolute values. Why? Because in Spain, in 2018, we approved a nuclear phase out. And already 2 power plants has been decommissioned. It is also true that at present we have a debate if this calendar for closing nuclear has to be updated and then postponed a little bit. Nevertheless, it is there. So at present we are implementing a nuclear phase out. Complete out the coal. So we don't have any more coal generation. 15 years ago, it was 8.6% of all the generation. And it's not only coal generation, but we have closed also all coal mining facilities. So coal is completely out of the economy. It was also mentioned, combined cycle gas turbine, it has reduced their power in absolute and relative terms. It was mentioned by Alison in the presentation of Australia. Of course, they cannot compete in price now with renewables. So, of course, more and more renewables are taking shares for combined cycle gas turbines. So if nuclear is going down, coal is off, gas is going down, who is now generating? So, of course, it's variable renewables. It's wind. They have increased 5% their share, but mainly photovoltaic that went from 2% in 2010 to almost 20% today of all the power generation. And then you have other renewables, which in Spain is big hydro. And you cannot really look to 1 year of hydro as we know. So rainfall, it changed a lot, so you have to see in longer periods. So, of course, last year was 15%, but this is not relevant, no? So, and why this wind and solar are overtaking the conventional renewable, the conventional power generation technologies? As I say, because of a strong political support, a strong political willingness. In 2020, we approved our plan for 10 years, the National Climate and Energy Plan, that aims to reach 80% of renewable energy electricity by 2030, and half of our full energy consumption in the economy from renewable energy by that year. This plan has 110 measures to support the energy transition. And about those measures, I'm showing you here 6 ones. So one of the measures is to develop a roadmap for green hydrogen, to develop a roadmap for wind offshore and other ocean technologies, to roadmap for self-consumption, prosumers, for biogas, for critical raw materials, for storage. And these roadmaps are very important because, as Rebecca said, this roadmap, they are setting targets for 2030. So investors, they can more or less know what is going to be the volume of the market and how this is going to be developed for all these technologies. And it's also identifying the challenges for each of them and putting specific measures to overcome these challenges, and also putting some figures on finance needed and some research and development chapter as well. It was mentioned in the introduction by Thomas, in Europe, and it's clearly the case in Spain, we have accompanied the development and the deployment of renewable energy, adapting the support schemes to the renewable energy, depending on the development of the market. So if you look to the end of the previous century, we started with feed-in tariff 98, and at that moment we were paying fixed price, all the electricity, photovoltaic, 180 euros per megawatt hour. Okay, but as soon as more companies start to install photovoltaic, as soon as scale production and reduction of the cost is coming into the market, then we move from feed-in tariff or fixed price to give the market price plus a fixed premium. And then again, with the development globally of these two technologies, wind and solar, then we say, okay, why to fix premium? Let's them to compete. Let's do an auction of the premium in 2017. And the result of the auction of the premium was 0. So photovoltaic and wind in 2017, they wanted to compete with gas. They wanted the price that gas was getting that year. And then when this government came, they say, then why to give them the price of gas if they can produce even cheaper? And then we designed and implement and pay as bid. And the result of the pay-as-with in 2020 was 24 euros megawatt-hour of photovoltaic, which is a problem. It's too cheap. I will come back. I will come back to that. Citizen role. This is more a qualitative than a quantitative trend. I think, yep, okay. Similar to my two previous colleagues, also one of the biggest trend or booming technology is, of course, prosumer, self-consumption. What do we have before 2018? Before 2018, we have that if you want to put PV rooftop, you cannot go higher than 100 kilowatt, and if you have a surplus, you have to give this for free to the distribution company. You cannot get any money or net metering, nothing at all, before 2018. One of the first things that the government did is to change the regulation for prosumers. We allowed any capacity, and if we allow net metering, so if you put electricity into the grid, you will get back the same amount of electricity, and then we also allow for communities, several people owning the same facility, and also that the facility has not to be in your roof. It can be just 1 kilometer around you. No? So with all these changes in the regulation, we have this impact. We have multiplied by 12 the 700 megawatts that were installed those days to 10 gigawatts today. 1/3 household, 2/3 industry. But it was not only the regulation, it is also true that similar to what we have heard from Australia, it was also support scheme subsidy to CAPEX coming from the recovery plan, so European funds, 1,800 million euros that are deploying 5.6 gigawatts. And also us in the Institute, we are part of the Ministry of Ecological Transition. We are the ones designing and implementing these subsidies to CAPEX, but also we are providing guidelines, and we are doing massive awareness among citizens to deploy these technologies. Another role of the citizen is energy communities. Energy communities is based also in the European Union policy. The European Union policy wants to put the citizen in the center of the energy transition. And of course, what the citizen can do today, the citizen can proactively buy renewable energy electricity from a provider. It can proactively finance through crowdfunding, for instance, renewable energy transition, and it can produce their own energy, not only in the rooftop, but getting together with other citizens to develop citizen-driven renewable energy large-scale generation, so the energy communities. And how we have fostered this in Spain, once again, using the money for the recovery plan. In the Institute, we have designed and implemented two strategies. We have give money to municipalities so they can run community transformation offices. These community transformation offices, what they do is they support citizens to deploy citizen-driven projects. So they will tell you how to create a cooperative. They will tell you how to go through permitting. They will help you in procuring your PV or your wind. So they will support you in these citizen-driven projects. And also, there is a second piece of this support, which is the subsidy support to CAPEX and competitive bidding from different projects. What is the results of the last 5 years on this? That 70 municipalities has their own community transformation offices, and in the last 5 years we have 146 energy communities, citizen-driven, large-scale projects feeding the grid. This is not rooftop, this is renewable energy generation feeding the grid, and it's well dispersed all the geography of Spain. Okay, one of the greatest challenges to integrate all these variable renewable energy into the grid. It was mentioned here today several times. The blackout, 28th April last year. It was not one single reason for this blackout. This blackout started in the west particularly in a region where we have no demand and large-scale generation. Large-scale generation from two technologies, nuclear and PV. In those days, nuclear was running 1/4 of the capacity. They have two reactors there, one was off and the second one was running half capacity. So 1/4 of the nuclear capacity it was only available, which means also that the grid was accepting a lot more variable generation from photovoltaics. And it was a sudden reduction of photovoltaic generation. And then the third episode that happened, or the third thing that came to increase, is to avoid perturbances in the grid, to give flexibility to the grid when this happened. Then the day before, combined cycle gas turbine one was contracted to support in the case of the event, and they were not able to come in time and in volume to support this incident. And last but not least, the transmission system operator was not able to isolate in this region the event, and this expand to the two countries, Spain and Portugal, and so the full peninsula. So there is not one single reason. It was, of course, for such a complex and huge event, it's not one single reason. It was the combination of many factors. So what are the challenges now? I was already mentioning the economic viability. No? We have seen last year in Spain that more than 800 hours of the year, so 10% of the time of the year, we have seen negative prices. You see here daily prices for January on the top, 2025, it can reach 120 euros in some hours of the day. 1 year after is quite below, and in May, the same year, 2025, you have a lot of negative prices, particularly during the day. So this is translating that the capture price by photovoltaic is too low. So average income for a megawatt-hour of photovoltaic in Spain is 34 euros megawatt-hour. So it is a limit, so it also creates questions with financial institutions for new photovoltaic. So new photovoltaic in Spain will only happen with batteries, it's clear. And then you see, for instance, in the top, in blue, how hydro, that they can regulate when they are producing, they are capturing as an average over the year 66 euros. So 80% more of what the photovoltaic is capturing as a price over the year for the electricity that they sell. So it has a lot of more value. And in the case of wind, is in green 62, 63. So also it has a lot more value, the megawatt-hour for wind than for solar. Also mentioned by the Australian colleague, we are seeing also some social opposition, rural areas, local. This is particularly for two technologies. Biogas is irrational. We cannot understand in the ministry how come. I mean, everybody wins. You get rid of our waste and you produce clean energy, but they don't want to do it and completely against it. So not clear. It is true that any waste market is a mafia, but nevertheless, still too much opposition. So, and the other technology also suffering opposition, particularly is also wind. No? But okay, we are trying to work with the different associations and trying to work locally also with the municipalities to try to understand that everybody wins if you deploy this kind of projects. Yeah, and we were and back again. No, the flexibility. The great challenge is to provide flexibility into the system. Also mentioned by two colleagues previously, we have even larger curtailment here than in Australia. We reached to 10% for both wind and photovoltaic. No, And it was mentioned by Ali in his presentation, no? That we have to update our regulation to bring more flexibility and, for instance, to allow more storage, and I will come back to this in my last slide, next and last slide, reinforcement of transmission and distribution grids, which means what Ali mentioned as well, is to allow TCO, the transmission system operator and distributor system operator, to do investment in intelligence, to do investment in power electronics, and to be sure that they are going to be rewarded for that. Which was not that clear up to date. Demand-side response, also mentioned several times here in the table, allow the new role or the new actor, which is going to be the aggregator, someone that may control locally many air conditions of many buildings, and he can sell this service to reduce demand whenever it is needed, no? And he will get paid for this. So these new actors are going also being now, we have an audience to draft this new regulation to update, and of course improve operational tools. So this is we are imposing now more restrictions to both big consumers and also renewable energy producers, so they have to be more reliable when there are disturbances into the grids. No? So basically, it's updating the regulation to have a more secure, reliable, and flexible system. And the last very big trend, similar to all my colleagues, of course, is storage. I already mentioned storage is going to provide you this flexibility. There is already the business case for storage because of the prices. And also we have designed and implemented support scheme, in this case CAPEX subsidy grants to storage. And we have seen how in the last month with 1,500 million euros, we are going to be able to deploy almost 7.7 gigawatts, but it's also true 2.2 are pumpage. So let's say 5.5 is going to be batteries. Mainly is going to be to hybridize existing renewable energy, to hybridize existing photovoltaics and wind, but also some standalone. They start to come into the market. Nevertheless, the business case is not that clear behind the meter as well. Once again, for standalone storage, we have to deploy new regulation, deploy new markets, which is the ancillary markets and how the batteries are going to be playing in the ancillary markets. And this is basically what I think this is okay. No more battery for this, I think we need. Okay, thank you. ありがとうございます。Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
So thank you very much, Hugo. In your presentation, you have already given the explanation, but this is a highly complicated presentation. I would like to make sure whether you have actually understood the point. In 2024, there has been a large blackout, and in Japan, that has made a big news in Japan as well. And of course, there has been several reasons for this blackout, and reports are now gradually coming out, but it was not really easy for us to understand. And initially, people have been screaming that it is because of the large-scale solar PVs, but it is not the addition of the solar PV, but how to manage the grid as well as the battery, and whether the instructions were given in a more effective and efficient manner. So thinking about stability and efficiency, you need to design the market. So what kind of lessons can we learn from Spain, please?
Yes, you're right. You have to take into consideration one thing. The electricity peak demand in Spain, it was 45 gigawatts, and it is from 2009. So this is not a matter of having more cable. So the existing cable, even less, because in 2009 there was less kilometers of transmission in Spain, was able to we were able to operate higher peaks of electricity demand with less cable. So it's not about putting more cable, it's about, as you say, operating better and to having more flexibility. You know, so this is the main lesson learned. As I say in my presentation, it was not one single thing that went wrong. It were at least 4 big things that were wrong. And what we are trying to do now is to ask for the transmission system operator to run the system more safely and also to put more intelligence into the network. It was mentioned by Aimory also these condensers, of course. Now they are obliged in 4 particular points to put more of these power electronics devices, but also to update the regulations so this is paid back to them as well. No? And also, as mentioned in my presentation, update our regulation so flexibility services are paid and are paid enough. Flexibility by everybody. Flexibility by their own renewable energy. Bringing storage. Flexibility by the demand as well. And flexibility by both the transmission system operator, but also the distribution system operator. So I think this is and one thing, because you are right, it was a very big thing, but I must say the couple of months afterwards the event, nobody talks anymore in Spain about this. We understood it was something that it happened once, and we are not afraid that this will happen again. And this is not bringing to any discussion anymore. So let's say the confidence on the reliability of the system is completely back. You know? I think people understood it was really something very rare and occasional. But nevertheless, all the measures in terms of technology and in terms of policy and in terms of market design that it has been on the table here in the discussion are being now designed and put in place basically to make a more flexible system, because not the future, the present is a 100% renewable energy electricity system with a lot of flexibility, power electronic and storage.
Thank you very much. Now, lastly but not least, for us Japanese, it is always, we are watching with very keen interest on what is happening in the United States. So now it's your turn, Professor Holtman. Nate, please.
Thank you, Mika, and I also want to add my thanks and congratulations to the Renewable Energy Institute for not just convening us today, but also for the history of good conversations and analysis that have advanced these conversations globally as well as here. The world is changing very quickly, particularly right now. And in that light, the U.S. is also changing quickly. It's very important for having us together at events like this so that we can learn from each other and bring our creativity jointly to understand how, with so many opportunities, as we've heard already this morning, we can also think about how we overcome the challenges that we're also facing ahead. So I want to thank REI for bringing us together today for that. So in addition to in the world much changing quickly, I think as we all know, there's much changing quickly in the United States. And I want to address that in my comments to you briefly this morning, this afternoon. I'm going to try to bring some of my perspective here, but I also want to recognize that it is at times difficult to separate out the noise from what's happening at particularly the national level in the United States from the reality of what's happening in the market, on the ground, in lots of different geographically distributed places within the United States, which, as I think everybody understands, is a heterogeneous and large country with many different types of activities happening all at one time, despite what frankly is kind of hard to discern from the national headlines. And I also don't want to avoid the reality that there's also some real change happening driven by the national government. So the first part of the conversation is just to go to reflect a bit on the past 15 years, as we've heard the other speakers do. I think that what I want to highlight is in the title here that we've overall the story in the United States has been a pretty dramatically shifting energy and climate policy environment at the federal level between different presidential administrations back and forth, plus evolving subnational policies, by which I mean states, cities, potentially even businesses, counties, other governance structures, and increasing market-driven action, as we've certainly heard from essentially all of the presentations this morning. At the national level, I want to highlight a few different trends. So during the Obama and Biden terms, we used what we call in our country kind of regulatory approaches during both of those administrations, with some reversals during the first Trump administration. We've had standards on greenhouse gases and other air pollutant emissions from fossil fuel power plants that have kind of come and gone over those cycles. We've also had, as an example, fuel efficiency standards for vehicles that were driving some transitions in our vehicle fleet. Very importantly, and I think for this group here gathered today, we had substantial federal tax credits for solar and wind in particular through the Obama term, through the first Trump term consistently, and then through the Biden term. Those are now gone. Those fiscal incentives that were built through the Inflation Reduction Act, which did deliver a substantial amount of new investment in clean technologies and in innovation across different types of technologies, those have now been largely, though not fully, rescinded. During the second Trump term, we have seen major changes using a few different presidential tools. One is executive orders, which is essentially a kind of presidential wave of the pen. There have been regulatory changes which are more thoroughgoing. They take a longer time and they have to go through courts and also through Congress, which is our legislative body, as we all know, and that has a sort of more durable dimension of policy longevity. I want to highlight, that's at the national level. I want to highlight an important feature of our system in the United States. It's not unique to the US. I think many of the countries that we've heard from already today reflect similar types of federal systems. But in our system, we delegate substantial policy authorities to states, cities, and other subnational governments. In particular, electricity policy has a substantial amount, maybe even arguably more authority at US states than it does at the federal level. So it's through these other policy authorities that we've seen additional action continue, even during these times when at the national level there might be reversals or changes. So in particular, I mentioned states have policy authority over electricity generation, and building codes is another one. Cities have policy authorities on waste, zoning, transportation, and wastewater is just a few examples. One item to note in the US is that there are substantial amounts of action happening that are driven by these subnational authorities, and I want to highlight those in my comments today. In particular, if you look at coalitions like America's All In and the U.S. Climate Alliance of States, they represent over 65% of U.S. population and frankly, almost 75% of U.S. GDP. That is an economy roughly the size of the second largest economy in the world. It's roughly the size of China's economy, and those are represented by leadership in the United States that has authority over these other dimensions of policy outcome. So at state level, you'll see things like greenhouse gas emissions targets, renewable energy standards, zero emission vehicles programs, landfill methane, and others. My state of Maryland is part of something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is essentially a regional greenhouse gas trading organization in the U.S. Northeast. City actions include other things like benchmarking, climate action plans, building performance standards, and others. Our analysis at the Center for Global Sustainability, we've been working on this question for a long time, and shows that there are substantial opportunities for additional action that can, in fact, reduce emissions beyond where they are today. And we could talk about that more if there's questions. In terms of the question at hand is the sort of how do we think about the last 15 years of U.S. energy transition? I've tried to narrow this down to a few slides, and I recognize our time is a bit limited because we're kind of low on time in today's session. So I'm going to highlight just electricity here primarily in the left-hand two figures. What you see on the left-hand top figure is net generation of electricity by source divided out by, coal, gas, nuclear, and renewables. And so what you can see here is that in the past decade, renewables are now accounting for more than 25% of U.S. electricity generation, with coal now dropping to about 16%. That's a decline of nearly 50% in coal, with renewables more than doubling in the past decade. Capacity build out for renewables, you can see on the bottom left-hand figure, that's our capacity change in the United States from 2000 to roughly today. And what you can see there is there's, of course, eliminations of coal on the negative side and additions of solar and wind, and now increasingly storage on the positive side in terms of capacity. So the story is that the solar, wind, and battery storage capacity has increased threefold over the last decade, now reaching over 300 gigawatts, with large annual capacity additions from solar, wind, and battery reaching about 50 gigawatts in 2025. That made up about 90% of our total capacity additions in 2025. And so again, despite what you hear at the kind of national level, despite the fact that the president may issue orders saying he really likes coal, that doesn't mean that the economy responds to that. He only has limited ability to drive action through his own, political strength, which, let's acknowledge, he has some force in the United States, but it is only in some cases a kind of a signed order saying we should be paying attention to more coal, but there's not much backup in that sometimes. So what you can see here is these trends, in fact, underscore that what we've heard about earlier today in a few different situations is also the case in the United States, which is that there is both a subnational policy driver as well as a market driver that is seeing substantial increases in the solar, wind, and storage capacities. Could that be higher with different policy architectures? Absolutely yes, at the federal level, but even so, it's not that there is zero action happening in the United States right now. EVs are a slightly different, actually I should mention oil and gas production has increased. We are a big oil and gas producer, as I think everybody knows, and that's still part of our national story. I'm not going to tell much of that story today, but that is something I want to kind of see that as part of my comments today. And then finally, EVs, we heard a little bit about that, for example, in the German case. REVs are about 10% of new sales right now, not zero, but minimal, and frankly a little bit disappointing compared to where we wanted to. A lot disappointing compared to where we wanted to be. How does this translate to greenhouse gas emissions over the last number of years? Here you can see since 1990, our emissions did peak in 2007, and that did decrease to roughly about minus 20% relative to our benchmark of 2005. In the past couple of years. I will note again, relevant to this group here today, the electricity sector in the past has driven most of these reductions, emissions falling by about a third over that period, as I mentioned before. In the future, as we look, we will likely see continued build out under different policy regimes, continued build out of renewables and in the electricity sector. In addition, though, we would have to see dramatically increased transformation in transportation, which would take up more of our future emissions reductions for us to hit anywhere near our kind of 2035 or even 2030 goals. I'm going to keep going on that. Okay, pivoting, since I know we're limited on time, pivoting to today. Where are we today? I think all of you have been paying attention to the US headlines, and you know that the federal government has initiated significant policy changes that reduce our emphasis on renewables, EVs, and efficiency, and support fossil and nuclear in particular. I mentioned before that these were delivered through several policy mechanisms, including budget reallocations, and I think that's an important one. I mentioned before that we have reduced the support for renewable renewables through that were previously there through our Inflation Reduction Act, and have removed regulations on fossil power plants as well as in vehicles. There have been efforts made, although these are still working themselves through the courts, to restrict subnational authorities such as state ability to regulate energy and climate policy. It is very important to note, I think if you followed in more fine detail some of the headlines coming out from the US, many of these big actions by the president have been challenged in our court system. That takes a long time to work through. So we just heard our courts strike down some of the major tariff actions that that the president had taken previously. Some of the actions on energy and climate will be are challenged in the courts and may be reversed, but some of them are already happening, such as the removal of the Inflation Reduction Act supports. That's because that came from Congress. In terms of the current political discussion, we heard a little bit earlier about the community support and the larger politics of some of the transitions in different countries and globally. There's opposing pressures, as I would call it, for renewable deployment in the United States. There's the decreased federal policy-driven support and reduced and sort of complicated situation as it relates to the global economic situation and Donald Trump's tariffs. That means, of course, as I think nobody's surprised, that, for example, in the United States, we do not have access to cheap Chinese solar or cheap Chinese EVs. That is a obstacle to our more rapid transition in this in my country. So that's kind of a fact of the tariff situation in the United States, which will slow those transitions. But there are, of course, other sort of countries that make those products that can supply some of the demand. At the same time, pushing the other direction is the rapid decreases in renewables costs. We've heard a tremendous amount about that this morning. And I think notably, we didn't hear about as much this morning, but in the United States, we have some significant supply limitations with putting new natural gas generation capacity online. It doesn't mean it's not there. It just takes 4 to 5 years for it to kind of be delivered because we have some supply chain bottlenecks in those technologies. So solar is actually much more easy to deploy in a rapid timeline, and coupling that with batteries, as we've heard already, is a way to serve the more rapidly increasing demand in the near term. As one example of that, there is in our country, just like many other places, growing concern both kind of in a national level, but also at various sort of community levels about both the electricity demand growth from data centers and the associated rising costs of electricity for consumers. And so how to feed that demand has been a big topic of discussion, but not only at the national level, but also in many communities and state levels. It's a really sensitive topic right now. EV adoption is not increasing. That's something that is regrettable in many ways. Domestic manufacturers in the United States are retooling. I feel it's a short-term addressing of a longer-term problem that they are maybe not making the right choice, but that's something that we need to be dealing with. And then, as noted, the affordability question, I think, is in many ways the central question around which our renewables conversations can revolve in the United States, because I think there's real strength in the renewable story that can be deployed, I think, with good effect. In terms of the current landscape, I think that one of the items I'd like to highlight is this idea that the subnational actors and businesses are in fact stepping up right now. Many of them are taking a sort of proactive stance, but it's not universal across the entire country. There are many states and localities, some of which will not be surprising to you, that are very kind of intensely pursuing a kind of high renewables and high sort of low carbon path. So, for example, you'll not be surprised to hear that California continues to lead and be very vocal in its support. The U.S. Climate Alliance of 24 leading governors representing nearly 65% of population continues to push forward, including our own state of Maryland. You see here Colorado and other places like Oregon, New York City, taking real policies that are changing their trajectories. But I also want to highlight the story in the bottom left, which was recently in the Washington Post, why MAGA, which is Make America Great Again, you might know Donald Trump's slogan, suddenly loves solar power. And the answer is not because Donald Trump loves it, it's because it's cheap and it's easy to deploy and it serves the demand where it's needed, which is a story we've heard over and over this morning. Now, that's just one story. It doesn't mean it's happening everywhere, but I think it's very important to note our politics are fluid and shifting. Things are changing rapidly, and it's something important for us to watch. I believe this is my last slide, so we'll wrap it up and let you all go to lunch. But one thing that's very important is this last point, that I think the idea is that the conversation is broadening in the United States right now. I think that's where we want to be pushing it, rotating some of the discussion around the affordability questions, understanding impacts of data centers, the opportunities for renewables there, watching what's happening at the subnational government level, and especially in what we call lower ambition states, meaning they're not as oriented toward climate, but if you look at states, for example, like Texas, they are absolute leaders in renewable energy deployment, even though they may not actually want to talk about climate particularly, or clean energy specifically in any kind of vocal way. They still love it because it's actually cheap, easy to deploy, and serves the demands. And so that's kind of a reorienting of some of our conversation. I want to note also that administrations do come and go. We heard that earlier in the discussion. A lot of us in different countries are used to oscillations. Of course, it's more significant and more severe in my country than in a lot of other places recently, but we do likely have possibly have some shifts in the federal landscape in our upcoming midterm election, and of course in November 2028. And as I wrap up, I just would like to say, given all of the fluidity and rapidly changing environment in the United States, and as a result of our country's policies, the fluidity and rapidly changing environment in the global economy and in many of the countries represented here, I do want to kind of underscore that it is, kind of our view here in our center and many people across the United States, that continuing to be in conversation with each other as we try to learn how to rapidly address some of the issues and challenges that are arising, I think becomes even more important than usual. And so I want to kind of wrap with an invitation and a request. If you have ideas, thoughts about how I or we could be doing better in the U.S., I for sure welcome that, and want to kind of welcome future constructive discussion around those questions. So with that, thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。非常に
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for speaking fast. And I wanted to have a comment from everybody on the panel, but we are running out of time. But unlike the past practices, this session, compared to others, we covered broad ground, the grid, battery storage, and others. But renewable energy itself cannot promote energy transition alone. We need to have a digital technology, flexibility on the side of demand, and also grid reinforcement. Combining all that, we are able to accelerate energy transition. That is one big theme that we would like to discuss in the future session concerning Japan's effort. Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause to wonderful speakers. Thank you very much. The members of the panel, please step down from the stage. This concludes the part one, the accelerating global energy transitions. We are going to break for lunch now.